All right, so the time is 10:20. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order and have a roll call. Mr. Emmerich. Here. Steve Reinhardt. Here. Barbara Evans.
Yes, I'm here.
Dave Motley.
Here.
Diana Rose.
Here.
Doyle Williamson.
Present.
Mike Morgan.
Here.
Robert John Dane.
Hello.
And if staff could introduce themselves, please, around the room.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Chelsea Buckholz, General Counsel.
Tony Slagle, Deputy Executive Director.
Denise Sample, Licensing and Registration Services Director.
Michael Malloy, Staff Attorney.
Amber?
Amber Hinton, Executive Assistant.
Jennifer Wheeler, Director of Education and Examinations.
Okay.
Mark Moore, Director of Standards and Enforcement Services.
I'm Tim Mayo. I'm the Staff Attorney.
Item number 2, discussion and possible action to excuse committee members' absence, if any, but they're all here, so don't have to worry about that. Number 3, ratification of the minutes of the April 15th, 2019 meeting. Is there any amendments that need to be done? Please state so at this time. If not, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll make the motion, we approve the minutes.
Motion made by Steve, second by Sean. Don't need to vote on that. Number 4, general comments from visitors on non-agenda items. Are there any general comments from visitors on non-agenda items? Seeing none. Prior to moving on to number 5, I just want to remind people that are on the phone, if you could please mute your phones if you are not attempting to speak. And you obviously, when you want to speak, please unmute and speak up, but just to try and keep down any background noise that may happen in the process. If you can mute your phones unless you are actually wanting to speak at the meeting. Yes, sir.
If I could also, this is a unidirectional mic, but if you could speak up so it catches everyone as well, since this is the minutes of the meeting is the recording. So.
Perfect.
Thank you.
If you're a guest here and you have not signed in, please do so. If you would like to speak on an agenda item, please fill out one of these forms with the item number that you wish to speak on. And we'll move on to number 5, reports from subcommittees. Start with the Education Subcommittee.
We have had some progress in meetings, and we'll go into it a little more later about updating qualification training and a little bit about the continuing ed updates.
Okay. Standards and Practice Subcommittee.
We met a couple of weeks ago, made some progress. It's going slowly. We need to have a discussion at this meeting on how we're going to set a particular standard on addressing the changes to the SOP. We came to the conclusion in our last meeting that we have some highly specific items identified in the SOP and some highly general items. So there's some discussion on how we can create more of a living document with the SOP as opposed to making constant changes to it in the future.
Okay.
When would we discuss that?
Well, it's not on the agenda.
Well,
but
I
could
mean, it doesn't need to be on an agenda. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you're not taking any action, if you're just giving direction to the subcommittee on what you want, how you want them to proceed, I don't think
No, it's just part of your report and conversation about it.
Yeah.
So basically now would be the time.
Yes.
So what we decided was there are certain institutions like the ICC that corrects, changes, edits, makes what we report on part of our standards of practice. So the suggestion was brought up, maybe by me, to maybe refer specifically to the ICC's direction on certain items that we're being required to identify in our reports. An example of that would be locations of safety class, locations of GFCIs. As we've seen in 2002, or 2011 rather recently, that we've added a couple of locations for GFCI protection. That would indeed require us to go back and amend the standards of practice to keep up with that as that change takes place. Whereas if we just referenced that particular code of the ICC for GFCI locations based on the most modern building standards, then that would allow us to keep this document alive without having to alter it. And it would also produce some direction from the education community on making sure that their courses are being updated consistently to keep up with those changes as they take place. One of the items that came up, which we are not reporting on, that has been code off and on and been enforced off and on in certain parts of Texas, is the child safety fall through on windows of certain heights that meet certain criteria. So as we discussed the addition of that particular item to the SOP, our question was, do we go ahead and identify those particular characteristics in construction that would qualify that window as a fall hazard and report it as deficient? Or do we just refer directly back to the ICC on what their specific documents are addressing? So that's where we're kind of grappling now, is how, and I'd like some discussion and some feedback from the committee here on which direction you'd like us to go in. I think it's important that we address this standards of practice rewrite as thoroughly and as critically as we possibly can, so that maybe we don't have to write it again, that it kind of changes as we direct it to change at this point, at this review. So any thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated to help us figure out if we want to be highly specific on the things that we're being required to identify, or more general, referring to another entity that has those specifics that we can refer to. I think the latter would drive inspectors more to become more combination code certified, which I think is a great advantage to our industry. It's just another level of education. But ultimately, we need to have this document be kind of like an insurance policy, where you have everything's covered but this, or nothing's covered but this. We don't have that is a consistent way of approaching this at this point in time. The standards of practice seems to be kind of all over the place on how that's set up. So that's what we're looking for, is some direction on, do we keep it as it is, where we're specific in some areas and general in others, or is it in the industry best interest to go in the direction we're thinking now, which is to leave it very general and, when possible, refer it to the ICC or other institutions that have these changes that are being made, that are being carried out in building construction. So thoughts on that, discussion on that?
Mr. Reinhardt.
I see exactly where he's coming from, specifically on items that are in our, what do we call OP1, the list of life safety items. In our preamble, that says we're addressing like safety glass or like GFCIs, but truly in our SOP, we're only addressing part of them. And it's because our SOP was based on the standard 15 years ago. So I can see where he's coming from in the preamble. It says we're addressing these the home inspection is a performance-based. If it works, it works. Doesn't matter how pretty it is. The caveat is this list of life safety items that we have set up in our preamble. But of those items, we're actually only addressing portions of them and not all of them. And there's kind of a misconception maybe on some of those areas. It says we address safety glass, but we kind of do, but we don't. It's kind of general in the SOP, so it doesn't really say we're addressing all the safety areas that have been updated significantly in the last 3 editions of the building code. So it might, in my eyes, if we were to address some of these by way of reference, it would probably be the items in the preamble that we specifically say we designated as life safety items. I mean, those are, if we're saying we're going to check on those specific things and those things are a moving target in the field, then maybe it's better off to kind of reference those moving targets with an entity like ICC that is pretty well found.
Okay.
Just an idea, because it's, the things like the safety glass and the GFCI, we're going to find them in old houses, but the intent is to inform the buyer the difference between the house they're buying and the brand new one that potentially would be up to that code. Not that the house broke. Those are things to be aware of, and we might as well make them aware of the whole gap and not just the gap between what they have and what we identified in the SOP in 2005. Because there's still a big gap that we don't address. The referencing code it's a touchy subject because we spent a lot of time saying we're not code inspectors. And here we are, the best answer to this question is probably referencing a code.
And that's probably one of my reservations, is starting to specifically reference the code. And I understand about, it would be a lot easier if we didn't have to go through this review every couple of years or whatnot. But I think I've always seen the SOPs as a living document, that it's something that does need to be revisited every couple of years because the industry changes, things change. But again, part of my reservations, I'm not a huge fan of putting ICC stuff on there because we don't want to turn the inspector into a code inspector. If you want to go as an inspector and you want to increase your knowledge and get code certified, I think that's fantastic. I think it's great. But I don't think that was the intent of what we're supposed to be doing.
But that preamble list is only identified in one place, and that's the code.
Right, but we can put in the SOPs to look for safety glass and be generalized in those specific areas so that we are looking for those. I'm concerned that if we start referencing the code in there, it's going to start us on this downhill roll where it's eventually the whole thing's going to be a code inspection, and that's not what we want.
And maybe there's an easy way to do what you want to do, as far as it's very obvious to someone in the field when we reference it, we're cutting and pasting right out of the code without the code numbers. Right. And maybe that's where we want to go, but the question is, do we want to make it a general statement of, like we have now, look for hazardous glass in certain areas, or the code spends a page on it, 700 words explaining where all the exceptions are and the things they are, and it's like the guidance in the field to the inspector is like, how specific am I to get? And that's where there are places in the SOP where it's very specific, nailed down to one line in the building code, and then other places it's kind of general.
Right.
We're going to look at this page of stuff.
I think that's the first question we got to resolve that we came up with, was the window section is very vague and the branch circuit section is very detailed, but they're both dealing with life and safety issues. So do we want to be generalized and say, inspect to make sure GFCIs are installed in proper locations and leave it to that and not go on and on?
What's proper?
Right. Or do we, but the window section says that. Check for safety glass. It doesn't say, it doesn't reference the code, doesn't reference the locations or any measurements. It's just very vague. But the branch circuit section is very detailed. So
And
I think what we came up with was we need to decide on one way or the other. Either we get very detailed on every section or we're very vague on every section when it comes to these code issues.
And the detailed on the branch electrical was based on what was in place 12 years ago.
So,
Brian and I looked at it last.
So we're not code inspectors and we're not structural engineers. We're an enigma, we really are.
Yeah.
But we throw a lot of opinions out based on our education and experiences related to code and engineering. When I passed the professional exam back in '98, there was a lot of really detailed, specific interpretation of modulus of elasticities and all kinds of highly detailed engineering terms that had to be known in order to pass that test. So we got to kind of accept the fact that as a home inspector, we have to have a pretty vast general knowledge of a lot of specialty areas. But what this really comes down to, this SOP, is this needs to be the guiding document for enforcement as well as the home inspector's daily task. When there's a complaint filed up there, I mean, enforcement, what do they look at? They look at the SOP. And if it's very general, what reference do they go to at that point to render a decision whether or not an inspector has violated it?
We go to the education that they're taught.
Education?
We go to the resources that they're taught, like Dearborn and all of that.
And those are based on building
What
code.
they're taught.
They're
Yeah, and
possible
basically
resources, not the ones that everybody uses.
Right.
Well, we use Dearborn.
I never
That's
used
This should be the document that's gone to determine
and
enforcement.
obviously, the more specific something is, it's easier to be enforced, but also, has to look at the education level of the license and the accessibility you're gonna have to allow people into the industry as well, so. The
Yeah.
more specific you get, the more difficult it will be to get into the industry.
Well, the SOP also allows us to fall back on our liability. I mean, hands down, that's where we fall back on. So when we talk about liability insurance and all these things that have come up over the years and will continue to come up, this needs to be the thing we fall back on. So the better that this is written today will allow us to fix problems within TREC in the future. I think this is our base document on everything for the inspector. How we go about doing that, I don't know. I'd like to set up another meeting to continue our progress, but without a direction from the committee today, I don't know if we can do that unless we have another meeting to make that determination at a future meeting.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So what happens, because it sounds like it happens somewhat from time to time, what happens if the SOPs are specific on a list of things and it's out of sync with what the current code is? Like what does an inspector do at that point?
A lot of the SOP is right now.
Or it's, very much
And a
so.
lot of things that were prohibited, let's say, or accepted 10 years ago, building code has evolved and modified itself, and we have not. We're calling things deficient that are allowed in building code. And we're confusing, we have to write it up, and it's not a requirement. I mean, it's not a requirement for new construction or things like that, so we're seeing the houses, and vice versa. We're allowing things that you can't do anymore, or we're not calling it deficient things.
And it's not universal.
Right.
Building code's not. You might have Leander that's enforcing one thing and Austin is enforcing quite another. So then you get in spats with the officials that are like, well, why are you reporting that?
So
The answer is, everybody's doing whatever. The sky's the limit on what everybody's doing to that. Some people are writing up the new code, some people are just sticking with TREC, some people are doing.
So in thinking of the SOP as the guiding document
Right.
to determine, what you guys do, and as we've talked before, it's kind of the baseline. You can go above that, but it's a baseline. I guess part of informing this conversation is what does that do? What are you guys going to do moving forward? Does the specificity create problems down the road when you're out of sync with it? Does reflecting the code cause it, it sounds like that causes its own issues. And then there's the question about this is, as you're saying, there's a slight
You want my-
safety issue. And then there's also the...
This is Robert Dane.
Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
I'm a building official. What I've learned over the years, right, is if I go into a house, if it's built in 1950, I don't obviously use the current code because it wasn't required to use the current code. But if a house is built in 2017, right, then I use the current code to inspect by, and that's how I do my inspection.
But you would be disciplined if you ignore the branch circuits on TREC's SOPs, no matter how old the house is.
Yeah, we have a duty as inspectors to identify the safety deficiencies of every house, whether it was built in the 1800s or whether it's brand new. It's just like I compare arc fault circuit interrupters when we were required to identify those as deficient as my 97 F-250 doesn't have airbags, and I'm not going to put them on the truck, but I know they're not there. So knowing that those arc faults are not in your house is just information. You don't have to go put them in, but it's not up to code if you were to build a house today. So we have a duty, I believe, to inform every potential home buyer of every potential safety pitfall, regardless of the
Why don't you
age.
just get detail on every section that we're not, and then require an update every 2 years like ICC does?
I think we need to be careful we get too specific, and I know we have some questions, and I will get to you guys. I think we need to be real careful we get too specific. This is a minimum standard. That is what the SOPs are. The SOPs are a minimum standard. As we mentioned, you can go above those, absolutely. But I would caution us getting too specific in this SOP. I think we're going down a slippery slope if we start getting way too specific on there, especially if we start referencing specific codes.
I think we've leaned away from specifics in the document and being more generalized, but having a reference for that generalization. Having a reference to go to say whether it's a building code issue or a fire safety issue, to redirect that decision to the entity that's the expert in that field, like ICC.
Let me go to Mr. Roselle. Had a comment?
Yes.
Please stand up and state your name.
Sam? Okay.
You don't have to talk to the camera. Just talk to the mic.
Bud Roselle, Norman E. Roselle Jr. on the Trek thing. ASHI, the American Society for Home Inspectors, and then INTERNACHI, they have standards of practice. And those standards of practice are quite general because code inspectors are very important to people's lives, and home inspectors are very important to people's lives. And we complement each other. We don't do the same thing. And as our SOP is currently written, it's impossible for any of us in the room to do a complete Trek compliant code inspection. Maybe on one day, maybe a day and a half, but and we're talking about the general public here. We're talking about 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, or we're talking about mansions. And so as we burden it with all these technicals, we turn us into code inspectors, it will be impossible for us to do a Trek compliant inspection. It is already. I've talked to some attorneys. They said, you can't do this in a day of making a living. It's not about me. I'm trying to do as many home inspections as I can to help as many people into their houses and get a safe house and a good deal. But to be burdened with a code-specific SOP, I just don't think it's practical. Now there's an Achilles heel here because we get fined all the time because they pull, not they, but you'll pull a reference out of some school book somewhere. We get fined for temperature splits on air conditioning. That's a dog we like to, beat, horse we like to beat regularly. There's no SOP for our temperature splits, yet we get fined for it.
I would make the argument that fine was not for a bad temperature split. There's many other issues that were there. It just happens to be the one thing everybody's focusing on. But
well, yeah. That's what they hung their hat on. That's what Trek hung the hat on, and that's the way that it worked. So, I mean, if you're going to hang me for something, it might as well be a real nail instead of an imaginary nail.
Well, it is a real nail. I mean, if that's the only blurb that you're pulling at it, and I get it because I see it too.
As an example, there are others. But to go back to it, the national associations, their SOPs are quite general, and home inspectors blow past them every day. Okay, I blow past the TRAC SOP, but to require us to do code-specific inspections on all the items in a house, go in there in 3 hours, go in there in 4 hours. I'm a 5-hour home inspector. Go in there in 5 hours and get everything that's on the SOP is pretty daunting. And you might want to take some allowances into that. I don't know. That's my comment. As a home inspector in general, not as a one-star action.
You had one that you guys lowered your hand.
Can I respond real quick?
Sure.
Just to let you know that we really are trying to get away from making it code specific. That we really want to make it more generalized, but because the history of the SOP has required us to be very specific on certain codes, life safety, fire safety primarily, we still have to continue doing those. So we're trying to grapple with trying to make it more generalized, which is the direction we're kind of leaning toward now, but still enforcing or having in the SOPs the items that we've been historically identifying. So that's our problem at this point. We don't want to do code inspections. We really want to steer clear of that.
Good. Stand up, state your name.
Random lead-on property inspections. Part of the issue too is we're not just doing old houses, we're doing new houses. And then you end up between the builder and code enforcement. And you end up in the middle because you've called it out. Local code enforcement does not use that. And then we're stuck in the middle, and all I can tell my client is, well, this is what Trek tells us to do. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of issues like that that go around as well, that we're told to call out things that are not necessarily enforced within the city limits that we're working in.
And every city's different, and they all have their own little quirks and codes and stuff like that. And Did I hear that we have a comment from somebody on the phone? No? Okay. Scott?
Great.
Very good, very good.
Tony, this is Barbara. I'll weigh in. You know, I understand the concerns, but we've kind of learned that if we're too specific at any point, it comes back to bite us. You know, just a thought.
Okay, great.
Yes, Greg House, House Inspection Services. Couple of quick questions and a comment on what was said down here. That OPI, what was the OPI form back in the day? Missing, and you mentioned missing items in the preamble on that listing. Which specific items are you referring to?
If you've ever looked at the home inspection report form, that preamble has a bullet list of about 12 or 13 things. That was a cut and paste out of, is it OP1 or OPI?
It was OPI, and that was a Trek form from years ago.
And it's still there.
Mhm.
But
I
we cut and
that.
pasted it and put it in the preamble, and those are things that were identified,
What's
most
missing?
of which before even me, that were thought to be important, but it's obvious those things were.
They've changed, but what my question is
modified.
what's missing?
Child safety fall hazard is one in particular.
there-
we're
well,
discussing.
So you're talking
there's a-
24-inch windows, second floor type thing? Okay.
Yeah, there is
Add it to the
potential.
list.
Yeah.
My suggestion to the SOP committee would be to put it back on the inspector. And if we go in the direction of being generalized, I would phrase something to the effect of that we would want to report per current standards or per current requirements. And that's actually how I write my own report. And that puts it back on the inspector to stay abreast of changes, stay in the classroom, stay up to date on what's going on. I'm really hesitant, me as a professional business owner and a professional inspector, I'm hesitant to start referencing ICC type stuff. Not so much that I'm afraid to put some numbers and dot something in my report, but we're taking building code stuff and trying to apply it against a residential situation as well. So, you know, thermal loads and things of that nature, we're way outside the scope of what we need to be looking at. And so my suggestion would be to change the language that puts it to where the inspector would have a vested interest in staying abreast of the changes as they progress over the year, because it's about every 3 years that IRC pops something new. And then we need to kind of catch up and see what's going on. We also need to be better at educating our clients. And so with what was the OPI, that listing that's in the preamble, perhaps just update that a little bit, change the language that puts it back on the inspector to say, hey, you really need to be up to speed on these things so that you can report them accurately. And that way that continues to be a living document, which you were mentioning earlier, just simply by the language that you use. And then we're not running back and making wholesale changes on things later. So, thank you.
And I, like you, have references to current industry standards, which is a blindfold moving target. Is that industry standard per the city you're in, the state you're in? It's kind of like, what's the current industry standard for arc fault implementation? You know, it's kind of like
all 15 and 20 amp circuits that are not GFCI protected.
Well, we've brought that up in
that's
committee.
a building code that's adopted by particular. I've got cities that are still in the 05, you know, different. They're not doing that.
The cities are the cities are the cities.
Yes.
That's not even part of our. That shouldn't even be in the discussion, because the city is going to operate on their own time and on their own specifications. We are reporting against if they magically built your home this morning.
Yep.
And then if there's a variation that's approved per city code, then okay, it's approved per city code. I don't understand where that's. I don't understand where that's a problem in our reporting.
That's and I don't have a problem making note of that. It becomes a problem in explaining to the client who says, this home, it's got a sticker on the panel that was inspected by the city Tuesday, and it passed everything there. Why are you writing it up that it's a deficiency? And it's, well, my SOP says, you know, it's a deficient if it's not in appropriate areas. And then I say per current standard or industry standard, and it's kind of like that standard is a moving target.
Well, we need to be much better at educating our clients.
Well, it's a standard geographically.
Well, number one, we are not local. We're state.
Yeah.
We carry a state license, so we are reporting on things that are international standards, not local standards. So that's the only way we can really do it, is to use the ICC. Even though they're not enforcing it in Austin, but they are in Leander, we still need to put it out there and identify it, because that's the minimum safety standard that's being applied.
Well, if we're going to throw ICC out, then you start throwing out the NEC.
Well, I'm not saying in particular we need to refer to the ICC in this conversation. What I'm saying is we're a state. We're not local. So by being state, we have a larger blanket to cover, instead of just trying to find out what Leander enforces and trying to find out what Austin enforces and keeping up with those changes. But also, modern standards have come up, and early on in this committee we're going through right now. And I can't remember why, but we didn't want to use a comment like based on modern building or construction standards. That again is a very general statement that I like. I think that works really well. And that leaves it up to the inspector to determine what are those most modern standards and keep up with his education. I like that way of going, but it didn't get considered early on.
And there's if we make a comment, or if we don't make a comment, which implies that everything is there, and then the client comes back and complains, well, yeah, it may have met the standard 3 years ago, but it doesn't meet it today, and they complain, then the question is, where will enforcement go to look for what should I have written up based on current industry standard? That's kind of the question.
Tony?
I just have a question, and it's literally is a question I don't know the answer to. How is it different to report on the SOP a standard that's not in compliance with the locals? In other words, a local municipality hasn't adopted a code, versus you're looking at a house that was built in the 1950s that isn't up to the standard code. I mean, the inspectors still, when they're telling you, I know when I had my house inspected 18 years ago, that's what happened. They said, your electrical line is coming in under these. That was up to code when your house is built. It's not currently up to code, but it's not, I mean, that's what it was at that point. You might want to get that looked at or whatever. I'm just curious as to what the distinction is. It seems like they're the same thing. One is the code doesn't apply to the municipality. The other one is the code doesn't apply to when the house is built.
Well, your inspector was spot on, because that's a safety issue.
Right.
By telling you that thing hangs low.
Still haven't fixed it.
But also, he was spot on by saying that, he or she was spot on by saying that this was code when the house was built. You couldn't do that today.
Right.
But we have an obligation to point that out.
Well, I guess my question is, when we're talking about getting specific to code and whether it applies statewide, or because there are municipalities that don't adopt codes, right? So I guess my question was more along the lines of the inspector feeling the pressure of some possible disciplinary action because they haven't called something out as deficient because the SOPs do it, when the local code, and you would think the inspector operating in that municipality would know whether the code applies or not. Isn't there a way for them to determine that on the SOP, that this is in fact current code standards, but this municipality hasn't adopted that, so this house is perfectly fine here in terms of that, but letting them know that it's a potential. I'm just asking. I don't know how it
don't
works.
want to see us having to know what this municipality enforces and what this one.
That's why we got to be state and not local.
Well, no, I understand. I'm talking about the local inspector knows these things, right? Or shouldn't they know these things?
Here's a problem in Austin, right? You got Pflugerville, Leander, Cedar Park, Austin.
I'm ignorant about this. That's why I'm raising the question.
I think that and I'm in the same boat. In Dallas, there's 30 different cities there, and they all have 30 different little blurbs and codes. And you start talking about whether it's owner occupied property or rental property, and all that's different too. I think if we get too specific in that, that's going to be a nightmare for any inspector. There's no way an inspector's going to be able to do that if you're having to start to keep that up.
And the SOP just says, right up, you have to report deficiencies in the electrical service entrance.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay.
What are those?
At what level do I consider something a deficiency? If I just have to write up deficiencies in the GFCI protection, okay, where do I draw that line?
We need to hash out SOPs.
How specific do you get?
Okay.
I have a perfect example.
Good. Stand up. Say your name.
Oh, I'm sorry. Randall Needham Property Inspections. Luckily, this was a home warranty issue, and luckily it was not an inspection. Went out to a house that was out in the county, brand new build, less than a year old, and this was only 2 years ago. Walked up to the electrical panel, opened it up, bank full of breakers and no main. So if he was coming in to buy that house originally, there's going to be a fight between him and somebody's going to back out and they're going to start pointing fingers. The builder says it's within code for the county, and then the homeowner's looking at me, and then people start pointing fingers. Real estate agent starts looking at me. Hey, you caused my client to leave and not purchase the house. So we get pointed at a lot in these scenarios because of these issues that where we're going by current standards, and yet the homeowner, the house was built in 1958.
We should never be telling somebody to not buy a house or leave, period.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not us saying it, but we've marked it deficient,
And it was.
and that brings a red flag to the client.
And it was deficient. There is no county code saying it's.
just
I
means
get
they don't
that all the
enforce it.
time. We're in the county, we don't have to follow codes, and it's like,
Yeah, that's not
that
required of
discussion
it.
is between the agents and the buyers and the sellers. We've got an SOP, and I tell them, so I have to make a note that it doesn't have a main, and it really should have had one for the last 25 years.
But you lose a real estate agent because you
That's-
called it out.
That's
That's
not the
the
concern of the SOP.
No.
Good.
It's just not.
Let them go.
I'm sorry, but that's whether we lose that relationship or not. Our job is not, our responsibility is not to the agent. Our responsibility is to the consumer.
That's marketing
Period,
and
end of
damage
story.
control.
Scott.
Scott Regan, Texas Real Estate Education Training, Greenwood's Home Inspection. State of Texas builds, the law is 2015 code. We as inspectors, no matter what it says in our SOPs, have to use current codes, which again comes out every 2 to 3 years. You gotta understand is municipalities doesn't matter. When I'm doing an inspection in Lockhart or Austin, I use current. And we gotta consider a lot of our current is changing just as fast as our cell phones are changing. And what's in our standards regarding air conditioning and plumbing and some electrical issues, we need to redo a lot of areas. Because temperature splits out the window now. AC units can go negative 30 degrees all across the board. Water heaters aren't even in there on the tank list. Electrical, there's a lot of electrical. But if we're gonna be specific on each item, then it's gonna put us back 22 years ago saying we're code inspectors. Generalize, narrow it down, and put it on the inspectors. Because we inspect for current today. I don't care if the house is 50 or 100 years old. That's what our job is. Safety issues for the consumer, I don't care about realtors. I really don't, because I get them and I lose them all day long. But I want standards that we work with. ASHI, NRASHI, and our joint states. We read some of the other states. I work in multiple different states. And yeah, we have 3 times as big a standard because they start putting in code. We need to look at a lot of that as we're doing this.
The other thing we have to really consider too is, we were talking a few minutes ago, or before we started, about the lack of inspectors. And Texas is growing exponentially. And if we make it, the standards too specific and too difficult to learn, these guys aren't going to make it. So we need to make sure that we address this thing in a manner that allows the new guys coming in a little bit of latitude, because they're going to get in trouble.
We've actually increased the number of inspectors pretty steadily over the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, we need to really kick it up because we're growing like
we
crazy.
were down really low a few years ago.
Yeah, it's doing.
We aren't where we were the pre-recession
challenge
levels,
is
but
the national exam, which is obviously very
Why is it like that?
reference type stuff.
I'm sorry. On the phone, who is that? Oh, okay. All right. So it's, from my perspective, it seems like everybody's kind of in agreement with you guys that probably stay more generalized. I think at this point, probably going back to your meetings and to bring something specific back once you guys go through the process to the full committee and kind of go from there. And I would invite anybody who has input or has made comments on this to attend and give your input at those SOP meetings. Because I think more stakeholder involvement that we have in this process, the better. Those meetings are not streamed on video or anything like that, but they are open to attend. The subcommittee meetings are not subject to Open Meetings Act but they are open for anybody to attend, and they're always posted.
They're posted, and we if they're meeting via teleconference, all you need to do is contact us, and we will provide you with the dial-in information. Because it's just, yeah, I agree with Lee. The more stakeholder input in this process, the better it is for everybody.
And maybe we need to, I mean, when Brian and I did this 8 years ago, if people remember if they were doing it 20 years ago, there were a lot of specifics. I mean, the laundry list of things to inspect on a dishwasher was long, and we changed it to deficiencies in components, and then left it up to you. Same with garage doors, things like that. So we went general on about half the stuff in there, and maybe it's time to go general on even more things and just say, you know, take out some of the specifics.
Yeah.
And it will leave the ability for inspectors out there that are not trained real well to miss things, because the details are things that we thought was important that people were missing, and we left those in there. But
it's a hard balance. I mean, it's a hard balance to do, because if you get too specific, then the inspector now has this huge checklist that he has to go through, and it's going to take a lot more time to do, and the cost of the inspection is going to go up. I mean, it's...
The belief was that if we made it more general, the good inspectors still have that laundry list. It says dishwasher specifics. My guy's got a laundry list. They're going to check through everything in there, and most of the good inspectors, even if it says just write up deficiencies in service entrance, and that's all it says, good inspector has a list in the back of his minor written on all the things he looks at that we may have in there now that we just don't pull out.
So walking away today, going back to our meeting whenever it's held again, can I walk away today understanding that the committee would recommend a direction in a more general sense with the potential for referring to modern construction standards as part of our verbiage?
And manufacturer.
I'm sorry?
And manufacturer.
And manufacturer?
Manufacturer overrides code. So that would be.
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
That's part of the discussion you guys can have. But I think, yes, unless I'm misunderstanding, I think everybody's in line with being a more general rather than getting overly specific.
Okay, so we'll do that.
Okay. Anything else that you had?
No, sir.
Okay. 5C, Enforcement Subcommittee. Nobody know. Okay. Move on to number 6, staff reports, administration and management services, please.
So this is Tony Slagle, Deputy Executive Director. The one thing I just wanted to speak to, and Chelsea, you'll remind me if there's other things I need to, but was the plumbing board issue. We got a lot of contact from the inspector industry about the fact that at the end of the session, the plumbing board seemingly was going to go away, as was the statute. On June 13th, the governor, by executive order, essentially kept it in place. So what that means is, and I've written about this in articles on the website, is that the current status quo about sewer line testing and or scoping and the static pressure testing, we're maintaining the status quo on that. In terms of the requirement that you have to be a licensed plumber, the plumbing board still has authority over those things, so we're not changing that current standard. And so they'll obviously take up the plumbing board at the next session, but as of right now, the executive order from the governor stands as law and continues the plumbing board until 2021. So, any questions about any of that? Anything else you need to comment? Okay, that's all I have.
Standards and enforcement services.
Morning. I have the report here. The first page and a bit of what's been done since the last, and then the remaining 5 pages is what we've done for the fiscal year. I will note, by the time we meet again, I guess that would be September, October. A lot of this will go away because it'll be a new year. I'll do a compiled, just one report for the annual from the past year just to cover the gap, the 2-month gap in between.
Okay.
And then to
I
start
think
with,
that's
let's
great.
then start with a new report for September going forward. Does anyone have any questions?
Was there a question on the phone? Okay, again, if you have a question, please speak up. If not, if you could please mute your phone, that'd be greatly appreciated.
I did, as directed last meeting, and started putting the links in there for the, so eventually they'll all be in there. I just did from the previous meeting forward.
So the one on 423 was a temperature drop issue. Failed to report sufficient indirect cooling. That one that she has highlighted.
Right there. Where the arrow is that?
190292?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Yeah, it's telling me I can't reach this page.
Yeah.
Do you want me to click
The
it?
link's broke.
Yeah, I tried to look up some of these, but I couldn't.
It worked when I tested it.
Is temperature drop?
Well, no, it wouldn't.
It's because you're using an intranet instead of, is that why it's picking it up, because it's on an internal?
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah.
I don't do all these. Me and another attorney does both these. So.
That's a new one.
To me, it looks like that would be the problem. It was just the temperature differential.
I just have one thing. So discipline on 521. If we're gonna run the AC.
Can you give me the case number instead of
If you guys, if we can lower the chat around.
191920. Performed an inspection on AC below 60 degrees without obtaining permission. So Trek would like us, if we're going to deviate from the Trek standards, to get permission from the sellers.
Well, I mean, that's why it was an advisory letter. So
I'm just trying to get
someone.
clarification.
There's some concern from the seller itself. It's his own AC system.
Right.
And he wouldn't tested it. It was, I don't know if it was like 56 degrees or something like that. It was low 50s or something like that. And there was no damage done to the system, but it was a potential for it. So we said, you know, if you're going to do this, since it's not your system and your buyer's telling you that we want to think it'd be more efficient, at least ask the seller if you have permission to go below what the, you know, what it costs.
Isn't there a prohibition of running the system below 60 degrees?
Yeah, it says
No, it says you're not required.
You're not required to, so.
Need to be a prohibition.
Not prohibited. It says
I've done
And
it
I
at
know there's
50
manufacturer
degrees.
stuff out there, but this thing is, I don't know. We don't know about the age of the system and any of that other information in the inspection report, so that's why we go by. I think there's two standards now. The one that says 60, but there's other one that says you can maybe push it to 58 or in the mid 50s. It's okay. So
You're not going to get a good reading.
That's inaccurate.
You can tell if
Horrible
it
reading
works.
method.
yeah, I think he was just turning it on and see if it worked. It was
Yeah,
it was November,
I wasn't gonna
December
debate
when he
the
did it.
temperature. I
So.
just wanted to know if Trek wanted us, what the kind of clarification on what we needed to do in those situations.
I mean, there's some
If we're
guys-
gonna
We
run
just
it.
said, you got to be careful because
Yeah.
there's a potential to damage the system, and it's not. I mean,
Maybe that's something for standards to look at, as far as.
I know there's
it's
been a
not
lot of
required if it's
questions
below
about
62,
people what's
not allowed. I mean,
what
without
it's
seller
doing.
permission or something of that nature. Maybe
Yeah.
that's something you guys can revisit.
Is it the same on the
Heat pump?
heating?
Yeah, heat pump on the 70
Does it
degrees.
say not required?
70, oh, at over 70 degrees?
No, not our standards. We looked at that last time.
There is.
It used to be, they got taken out.
There's a limit on heat pump.
Yeah, I know there's out there some of that, but it's not currently in our standards. We
No.
talked about that last time.
It's I don't think it's this. But yeah, there's.
Right. It might have been in the past.
But with new systems coming out, I know that stuff is kind of all over the place.
Yeah, stuff changes.
When they have heat
So
pumps.
that's something the SOP probably should
When
look
they
at.
have heat pumps that can
Put the
work.
70 back in there if that's the case.
Work in all type of environments and stuff
And
like
like
that.
you were saying about the cooling performance, our general standards say age appropriate too. And it's like, how do we You know, if it's.
That's where we start getting
It's at
the
15 to 18 or
specifics,
18 to 20, is that on a
Or
new
tell 'em what
house or
kind
a
of drop they have to
30-year-old
get.
unit?
Yeah.
When
Specific.
our standards say age appropriate. To me, a new one might be 20, a 30-year-old unit, 12 might be great because I'm using the age appropriate.
Well, it's real
I'm
human
afraid
too. I mean,
Depends on where
that's,
you measure it, there's just way too
Oh,
many.
yeah.
Hang on. Gotcha.
To the extent that, understandably so, that the industry gets upset with enforcement going, talking about things and there's some inconsistency, it seems like that's also should be a concern or consideration in terms of the SOP, is that help provide some
Right.
consistency with that too.
Exactly.
Because, if it just says, as you said, what was the term you used?
Modern standards, general.
Yeah.
There's a
instruction.
general thing, then enforcement's gotta go and figure out what was taught and look at this stuff and then
Right.
determine and that provides some inconsistency there. So there's an inconsistency on the front end to the consumer who's getting the report from the inspector, and then on the back end from the inspector, who might get disciplinary action based on that as well.
So that follows us right back around to,
Right.
do we reference ICC?
No, I know. I'm just saying that that's something that we need to think, as you said, bring us forward, is in consideration of updating the SOPs is providing this, because that's one of the reasons for it is to provide some consistency in these reports across a very large geographic area. So,
Mr. Malloy, you have anything else?
No, sir.
Licensing and registration services?
Yes, got, this is Denise.
I apologize, I skipped education. I apologize. Let me step back. Education and examination services.
8.
Yeah, you can sit on the other end of the
Keeping the
table.
L3 first.
See an opportunity with the other end of the table.
Line up, right?
We'll sit in order next time.
yes,
So, Jennifer Wheeler, Director of Education and Examinations. This is the L3 report, inspector examination activity for June fiscal year to date comparison. So, total examinations passed for professional inspectors is 362 versus 425 last year. Examinations taken, 662 versus 846 last year for professionals. Total applicants examined, 466, for a total of 662 examinations taken by those number of applicants. Pass rate, exam pass rate, 54.7% for professional over the 50.2% for professional last year. Applicant pass rate 77.7% over 72.9% last year, and then first attempt pass rate 51.7% over 49.1% last year. I just referenced primarily the professional inspector license since the volume of real estate inspectors is so much less.
For some reason, I didn't have L3 in my package.
No, we have it right here.
yeah, it was updated.
It was supplemented.
So,
Okay.
I apologize.
Does anybody have any questions on this report? If not, moving on to the L4, which is the instructor report.
Is that the one with the typo in April?
Yes. Yeah, I have IT looking into
like,
that. And actually, if you look at it, it's,
Like
it's
everybody's
almost
doubled.
like a duplicate.
Yeah, everybody doubled.
Right. That's the April 19 numbers that you'll see for inspectors. So inspectors are at the bottom half of the page. We have 42 ICE elective only instructors, and then 130 qualifying and ICE electives combined, 52 approved to teach the SOP and legal ethics update courses, and 73 approved ride-along course instructors. Does anybody have any questions about this report? Okay, thank you.
Well, now, licensing and registration services.
Denise Sample, Director of Licensing and Registration Services. The data that we've got here is through May of 2019. So the L1 report, the inspector information is at the bottom half of the report. And we've been reporting on September of 2018 as sort of an anomaly and a record low number of applications that were received. So removing, I kind of pulled some pulled some old reports and removed the September 2018 and September 2017 information to make a comparison. And the overall difference in total original applications received when you remove September is a drop of 9.02% in total applications. So as we continue reporting, it does show September 18 was just an anomaly. So we've got the previous 2017 renewal activity rate to compare to 2019, since we're measuring the same number of license holders. Are there any questions about this L1? And then moving on to the L2 report. This is the same report that you guys have seen in the past. This is a 13-month comparison from May 2018 to May 2019 of total number of license holders, broken down by active and inactive status. And the inspectors are there in the center. So overall, holding steady total of 4,114 inspectors at the end of May. And if there are no other questions, that concludes my report.
So we have about 360,000 people a year that move to Texas. And at 4,100 inspectors, we're not going to keep up.
On 557 inactive.
Yeah, 3,500.
Yeah,
3,500 active.
Where's the total?
41's the inactives included.
That includes 557 inactive.
So what was the number for total active?
3,557.
Even worse. So yeah, if we don't work on getting inspectors licensed and renewing, we're going to be in trouble.
Well,
I don't know how we.
I think supply and demand kind of tends to take care of that. I mean, it was when the market, when we had the recession, our numbers went down
They were
substantially.
like 20, 28.
Yeah, like 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and there was an excess. I think we were up over 4,000 at the peak of that, and then really tanked down.
We were almost at 5,000 and dropped to 27 in 1 year.
Yeah.
Right out there.
Are there areas where there are too few inspectors?
No country.
There's too many.
Make those Texas.
There's areas that there's way too many.
There are. There's oversaturation in some areas.
Houston's got a ton.
A lot of it's the marketing of the schools, and it's it's not like the state markets to this.
Well, I just feel like if we have a
We've
a
lowered
higher
the standard.
population of inspectors, we have more to say.
I think the pre-licensure program that we're talking about, I think will help with that.
I think
because I think the 455 hours is a very daunting thing for somebody to look at.
Yeah, I know it's all being addressed, which I greatly appreciate. This year, this committee has really, taken on a lot, and I think by doing that, we're going to be able to kind of prepare for the future. But it's coming; it's already here.
All right. Did feel the nerve from that. Okay. Moving on. Item number 7. The fun one. Discussion and possible action regarding contractual limitations of liability. So, this one got brought back up, as we've been talking about this for well over a year. That it came up originally from staff about concerns that some inspectors have in their inspection agreements between them and their client that limits the liability of the inspector to the cost of the inspection. And there's a state statute that basically states you have to have a certain amount of E&O or liability insurance for violations of subchapter G. So the concern there was, from what had been coming out, was that there were attempts on TREC's behalf to start getting involved in the agreement between an inspector and their client, and that was not the case. The issue here is TREC, from my understanding, was concerned that these agreements that many inspectors have in place, and I know I've seen them too, so it's not a question of did this actually happen or did this mystery inspector show up. I've seen these myself where inspectors limit their liability to the cost of the inspection. So the issue then becomes is TREC wants to find a way to help notify the consumer that the liability statute is there, basically, so that you can't have an agreement between you and your client that is in direct conflict with state statute. Period, end of story. You cannot limit the liability of the cost of the inspection if it directly conflicts with state statute. And the state statute states you have to have it for violations against subchapter G, which include negligence or incompetence, agreement for specific report findings, saying it's contingent on findings or so on and so forth, acting in conflicting capacities, broker and an agent, undisclosed principal, repairs and maintenance, and violation of law, which includes rules of the commission. So, from my understanding, nobody really has an issue with the fact that you can't limit the liability that is in direct conflict with the state statute. The question here becomes, how do we notify the public of that? How does the public know that if they read something, if an inspector chooses to keep that in his agreement, that it's just his whole liability is just a cost? How does the consumer find out that there's a state statute there that gives them some protection for if the inspector violates subchapter G? So my first thought, because we're going through an SOP real review and talking about the OP1 and stuff like that, is if we couple this possibly with a form update. I know nobody loves to do form updates, but it has been over 3 years since we've done it. To include some, maybe one line or whatever the case is, that mentions the state statute. I am not a fan of putting the dollar amount in there, because I think if you put the dollar amount in there, that puts a huge target, and that's all anybody's going to see is that dollar amount. So, but I would be okay if we put something maybe in the OPI to notify the consumers of inspectors are required to have a certain amount of liability insurance for violations of subchapter G, and direct them to where they can find out exactly what those stipulations are of subchapter G.
How did they do it with the sales and brokers?
I'm sorry?
Do they do that with sales or brokers or other?
They're not required. Brokers are not required to have liability insurance.
There's a small
Appraisers?
population of brokers that are required,
Right.
and I forget what.
If the broker owns less than, I believe, 10%.
Business entity.
It's a business entity,
The designated
10%.
broker
If it
owns
doesn't-
less than
owns
10%.
less than 10%, then they have to have Otherwise, no broker or agent has to have.
Do they post that somewhere that's available for the public? I was just looking to see if there was some other guidance that somebody else is already using.
I don't think so.
We're the only ones that are blanketed with that requirement.
Lee, are you calling
We had the requirement for informing them about the recovery fund. Why not just modify that?
I'd be perfectly okay with that. Like I said, I want
Because
to
they're
get
both here, recovery fund
Yeah.
and,
Well, and I think they tie together
yeah.
because the liability covers the side, the recovery fund, and ideally would cover the general side. My issue here, I wanted to bring this back up because there's been a lot of misconceptions over what this actually is, and I wanted that to be on the record and clear that my understanding is Trek's not trying to get involved between the agreement between the inspector and their client, other than the fact that it just can't be in direct conflict with state statute. Simple. That's all it really is. Am I wrong in that?
No, that's exactly right. And Chelsea Buckholz, this is new for me. This is an issue older than my experience at Trek. So I look forward to hearing from folks who have, comments on this, because I do not want this to be an area of great contention. And I know that it bloomed into that a year or so ago. I think we've narrowed the issue substantially so that the way that you have described the issue is all that is on the table. It's how can we how can we address the consumer protection issue of them knowing what the law says, that inspectors are required to carry liability insurance.
Consumer protection notice.
And if inspectors in their agreement try to limit the liability, how is that not in conflict with state statute? Because,
Well, you can limit the liability as long as it's not as a result of a violation of subchapter G.
Okay.
Basically, an inspector should be able to limit the liability to the cost of the inspection to prevent frivolous lawsuits, because that's a lot of what people want to throw inspectors under the bus when something goes wrong. But if it's a direct violation of subchapter G, okay, then that falls under the statute. But if it's something else that is outside of that scope, then Trek has no say in that. Has nothing to do with it, because it's not a conflict of state statute.
Right.
Because Trek we don't need to be involved in the agreement between an inspector and their client. Period. We just have to make sure it doesn't violate state statute. So you can have it in your liability that you're limiting the liability to the cost of the inspection, so long as it does not conflict with the state statute, which is a violation of subchapter G. Okay, so we had some public comments. We'll start with Mr. Rozelle.
Again,
You put it on there.
Yeah, I did. Roselle, Good Home Inspection. Everybody says their company name, so Good Home Inspection. That's me. I've got questions about this. I don't really have comments, and some of them have been answered. So, real estate agents aren't required to have insurance.
Correct.
Okay. Are they allowed to limit their liabilities? Do they write contracts like that?
Sure, there's no state statute that as long as they don't violate any state statute.
Okay, they're protected by the professional services exemption for the TDA. Is that correct?
I do not know.
Okay, and so as attorneys,
they can be sued under the DTPA as
Yeah.
well. So.
they can, but
And are
Anybody can.
regularly.
right,
Yeah.
I know they are. Maybe it's the attorney's fault, but professional services exemption, realtors have that. Agents have that. Do we have that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. So do you have the professional services exemption?
Do
Is that
I?
the question?
For the DTA?
I do not know.
DTPA.
DTPA.
DTPA, okay, yeah, I'm less Dexter.
Deceptive Trade Practices Act.
Yes. So-
I'll look that up.
Because agents have that, and I just want to know if inspectors have that. I know attorneys have that.
I would be surprised. Do you know?
I don't think so, because real estate agents were specifically added to the statute, I think 2 or 3 sessions ago.
So they have that protection, but home inspectors
They have a big lobby
don't.
too. So
I do not.
yeah.
Right.
We do not.
So
So
they-
no, you're not included as far as I know. So, no.
Okay, and as an attorney and in private practice, do your contracts limit your liability?
I'm not in the private practice anymore, so I couldn't.
But when you
I
were,
mean, some do, though. I mean,
Depends.
that is a very typical contractual provision for a lot of professionals to have a limitation of liability. You're
Okay.
exactly right.
and then Head versus U.S. Inspect upheld the limitation of liability in court. That's a law that's been set.
Not
So-
in Texas, right? Where was that?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was before we had our insurance
and-
requirements.
Prior to 2007.
And it was. But is this more of an issue that belongs in the court to decide whether to overturn U.S. Head versus U.S. Inspect?
You hit the
rather
nail
than-
on the head. That this would be determined by the courts as to whether or not that provision is enforceable and to what extent. And they would weigh sophistication of the parties, whether both parties are businesses, all sorts of things. So yes, you're exactly right.
Okay.
However, I want
No,
to clarify
please.
something. That doesn't address the consumer protection issue, which is to simply let the consumer know what the statute says,
Right.
which is all we're talking about here.
Okay. And then just one other question is, I've been in this room and another room, but my recollection is that Texas Real Estate Commission has publicly explained that they don't want to get into home inspectors' reports. It's not their, excuse me, not the reports.
Yeah, we do get into that.
Yes, contracts.
Correct.
So I was just, that's still their
Again,
position
as
of
Lee
the
said,
main-
outside of, if there's a direct conflict with the statute, we need to weigh in on that, but you're correct. That's not anything, we're not in the business of determining what your contractual language says, other than to make sure that any consumer protection issues that are raised by the statute are in fact addressed.
Gotcha. And now, I don't do a lot of this, but I've done a little bit of expert witness work. And I've noticed that quite often attorneys would jump right past the Fair Trades Practices Act. And, so then home inspectors and other people, not just home inspectors, but they're sued for more than the limitations, and it always goes to arbitration. So it's never really settled.
Well, that's more of an issue that the inspector needs to address with his attorney and their agreement to ensure that that agreement is shored up. Again, this committee, Nortrek, wants to get involved in that agreement, period. Other than the fact that it just cannot conflict with the current state statute.
Wait, you don't want to get involved with it other than, which means you gotta.
No, we're just saying you can't limit the liability that's in direct conflict with state statute. You can't violate state law in your agreement.
But shouldn't that conversation belong in the court rather than Trek?
Trek's just saying that they want to make sure that we inform the consumer of their rights in the matter. That's it.
That's what we're talking about, is putting something so that it notifies the consumer that there is a liability statute that states that inspectors are required to have a certain amount of liability insurance for violations against subchapter G.
I do have a question for you, though.
Yeah.
Do you see another way to protect consumers on this issue?
I think Lee just kind of hit it on the head, that the language, just like we had the recovery fund, and he said that earlier, but I just had these questions because you're making decisions, and so I brought that up. But,
no, I think it's
but on the spot here, I'm going to, I'll probably have a moment later, senior moment, recovery moment. But yeah, some language that would let them know what they have. We're supposed to post in our offices that we have a recovery fund. My office is my report, so it's baked right into my report, this recovery fund statement.
No, well, that's good. And if you do come up with ideas, bring them forward. But I think that we need to address this in a way that there is some consensus.
Gotcha. And then another question that I had is came afterwards, but this always comes down and it says staff recommends this. Staff recommends this. So I'm just wondering where this pressure is coming from. I mean, staff is a pretty vague.
Well, regardless of the individual it's coming from, this came up because Trek had received a complaint, I believe it was from an attorney, that an inspector's agreement between them and their client limited their liability to the cost of the inspection. But it did not specify. I mean, it was a blanket statement. It basically limited the liability to the cost of the inspection. And that is in violation of the state statute. And so therein lies, that started the question.
Gotcha. Can that complaint, can we see a copy of it?
I don't know if they have it, but I know that I've seen 4 other inspectors' agreements that say the same thing.
I think everybody.
No, the complaint, not the statement. My statements, my comments.
I don't think it was put in the form of a formal complaint. I think it was a question brought before staff of, hey, I have this case going on where the inspector has limited their liability to the cost of the inspection, but isn't that in direct conflict with state statute? And that's where the
happens
question.
a lot.
And that happens all the time.
Where just a question will be raised to general counsel inbox, or they'll pick up the phone and call and say, what do you think of this? And then I'm learning as I go here. That starts this spinning wheel of research, right?
So, hearsay has brought us to this point.
I don't think it's
hearsay.
First off, an FAQ question.
First off, regardless of where it started, fact is, it's an issue. It's an issue.
We need to identify that the legal rights of our clients are protected.
Absolutely.
And we do that on the top of my webpage where it says Texas Real Estate Commission's Consumer Protection Information link.
Yeah.
It's in that document. It's where we're supposed to be. They click on that, they know where their protection is. So if we place that verbiage in that document, we're clean.
Which is all we're talking about. Like I said, I just don't want the dollar amount to be in there.
I agree.
Because I think if you put a dollar, the numbers and zeros,
I think you got a
that's all everybody's gonna focus.
99.9% opinion in the inspector industry that is not going to fly.
You have other comments?
Yes.
We also have Mr. Harbuck said he had a question.
Okay, we'll go and let Mr. Harbuck go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry to interrupt here. I think that this is being followed very well by the attorney, Chelsea, as well as the previous attorney, and I feel like the committee is trying to take this on in a good way as well too. My concerns are more with how does this? I mean, this is kind of an interpretation of a law, potentially some rules as well. And the way that in Texas we make sure that everybody knows about changes in rules and laws is through the Texas Register. I know the newsletter is a good tool too. I don't discount that. But for it to be officially an interpretation, I'm just wondering if maybe some sort of a opinion by Chelsea that would end up in the Texas Register, or some other way of making sure it gets in the Texas Register. We all use the Texas Register as kind of our resource for changes in rules, and this is, I don't know that this is a change in the rules, or but it is a change in interpreting the law and how it applies to, in this case, the limitation liability clauses. Is there any way, Chelsea, that and by the way, thank you for offering us to give comments on this. I appreciate that. Is there any way to kind of make sure that what happens here ends up in the Texas Register?
Well, let me step in real quick. We are not trying to interpret anything. That is not what we're doing. We're not trying to interpret law. We're not trying to determine law. All that we're talking about is notifying the consumer of their rights based on a state statute that relates to this industry. That is all that we're talking about. We're not interpreting law or changing anything.
I think it's more like highlighting I mean, this law hasn't changed. So this is really just highlighting it's not a shift on the part of TREC, I guess is what I mean. Yeah, Mr. Harbuck, we don't typically post, well, I don't know if it's even possible to post articles or clarifications or anything other than rules in the Texas Register. So unless this were a change in rule, it wouldn't go there. But we do have other mechanisms of notification that could take place if it's deemed appropriate. I don't know that we're there yet.
Well, and the other issue is inspectors may read the Inspector Insight in the newsletter and stuff like that, but the general consumer does not. So the issue here is not whether inspectors know the rules. Most inspectors do know the rules. The issue here is to ensure that the consumer knows what their rights are as it relates to this state statute. And I don't think the Texas Register will fix that either.
Right, and I agree with that. I think that it's a good move to put something in a consumer information brochure or page that might document other consumer issues as well. I'm not opposed to that. I think that's fine. But we all have to admit here that this is something that hasn't always been interpreted this way. So regardless of how we would like to say, well, it's just an interpretation and it doesn't, it is a change. Hands down, it is a change. And I just would like to make sure that people are protected by being given notice about it, so that, we make sure that people are, the inspectors as well, not just the consumers, that there's a change here. That's all.
With all due respect, I disagree with you there. I don't think this is a change at all. I think the statute has been in effect since '07. And because TREC does not get involved in the agreement between an inspector and their client, this hasn't come up. It's not that it's a change. What happened was TREC was made aware that certain inspectors were limiting the liability.
In fact, he found an email where
I found an email from 2018 that, and this may not be the first one. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
Just because there's been conversation in the past that that there may not be any basis for this, and we have an email right here that says from the person, in June 2017, we had our home inspected by a TREC licensed inspector. After the inspection, we found out the electrical system had major flaws to the tune of about $4,000 plus. These flaws were in plain sight. Our inspector has claimed from day one that he is not liable and is holding under a clause in the contract, period. So that's where this kind of came up. It's not an official complaint. Enforcement didn't act on it. They referred to the person and said, we can't do we need an official complaint. You may want to seek an attorney to look at this, but it was not anything but this raised the question. And I don't know how often we see things like this, but I do know from time to time we get an email about someone who has, in their mind, had something that the inspector should have found, and the inspector, when it was brought to their attention, the inspector says, you signed this contract and the clause says it's limited to the cost of the inspection.
Didn't it start in 2017?
Thank you, Tony.
You're welcome. I just wanted to make sure that so there's not this
idea
that we're just kind of...
Thank you. I had questions.
Yeah, no.
So what was the previous staff attorney that we had?
Carrie Lewis?
No, 2 times ago, 2 or 3 people.
Oh,
she's still here. Yeah,
Kristen. 2017, she brought it up.
She brought up a separate issue.
She brought up a separate issue.
This opened up the can of worms, and then she was magically reassigned after it got really bad.
So that was a separate issue about defense within limits, which we determined is not
right.
But this
that was kind of tail end of it.
This actually has been brought up previously. I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago it was brought up again. Because it does pop up occasionally, that there's a statutory requirement, and then what happens when an inspector says it doesn't apply to me. So,
Well, in a lawsuit, from an inspector's perspective, if they have a limit of liability for the $500 inspection they charge, any attorney is going to recognize immediately on complaint that that's not going to stand. It just
Right,
never
especially
stands.
if it's in violation with the statute,
Right.
absolutely. And that's where our concern was, is to make sure the consumer knows that.
Right.
So they don't sign this agreement and go, oh, I'm limiting my liabilities to cost, even
Right.
if he's negligent
It's a
or whatnot.
ploy.
So it's a
It's
ploy.
because
contractual
that's
ploy.
really who you worry about in these cases, is not the consumer that goes, I don't care what this says, I'm still going to pursue, but the one that goes, okay, I guess I'm out of luck. If it's a legitimate claim against the inspector, the one that says, I guess I'm stuck with this $400, $500 inspection fee, that's the person you worry about, not the one who's going to say, I'm still going to pursue this. And I think you're right, because I think most insurance companies would say that if this claim were brought up to them, they're going to settle it. They're not going to say, well, the contractual clause says that. I could be wrong about that. I don't want to speak out of turn, but.
So this is basically what it boils down to, is the statute's been in place for 12 years now. We're not trying to change anything. I'm certainly not proposing that we change anything. The rule has been there for 12 years. The only thing I would propose is that maybe staff drafts language to possibly add to the OPI or the preamble as part of the review of the SOP, so we all do it at once instead of changing the form multiple times, to include something to the fact of that there is this statute out there for violations of subchapter G, and maybe put a link to what that
Is it better
statute
to
is.
do that? I'm just asking. A
It's-
consumer protection
Yes.
notice, or versus the.
Yes.
I'd be perfectly fine with that too.
We
Absolutely.
got to be careful with our preamble, or it's going to be 5 pages.
Yeah.
I'm just saying in terms of what you hand someone and what the intent of it is. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, because I know someone brought that up earlier, amending that to address this. might
That's
be-
where it belongs,
it's
because
already out
that's where we're driving our consumers to, is that link on every website,
We
which is
will,
what everyone uses.
I'm perfectly fine with putting it
We
on
will
there.
bring
Absolutely.
something to
Sure.
the committee,
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about we bring something to you?
Okay.
yeah, in October.
But I know we've kind of beat this dead horse here, and I know there's other people who want to make comments. I will get to you. I just want to make sure that we're clear from the get-go, because there's been a lot of misinformation that has come out about this specific issue, that we're not changing anything. This is all about informing consumers about what their rights are as it relates to this particular statute. That's it. Scott.
And if I,
I'm sorry. Who is that on the phone?
yeah, Stan, yeah. If I could just clarify that, my point is not that I'm against the interpretation. My point is only that I'm concerned that we need to have a good, solid legal way of notifying everyone, including the inspectors, that it's being interpreted this way. Obviously, that inspector in that email didn't think that it applied at all. And so that's one of the people that needs to know that, you can't do that. You can't say that. It's the consumer paragraph that we put in the preamble says that, and now it's not, it's purposefully not allowed,
Okay.
conspicuously not allowed. That's all, just a notice issue, that's all.
I think the way you explained it would be a good little blurb in our legal and ethics update.
Since we're reviewing that course, that
Because
probably is not a bad idea.
I don't think we addressed that specifically, and we're still, it's on a future little agenda
Yeah.
here about the legal and ethics. I think a little paragraph of that in the update
That's a great idea.
would be clear, and maybe even some examplars of what's in G and what's outside of G that we're trying to cover.
That's a good idea. Okay. Scott? Great. Mr. House?
Yes. Do I have to stand?
Yep, and say your name.
Greg House, House Inspection Services. I'm also the current chairman of the Association of Texas Real Estate Inspectors. We're a North Texas Trade Association. I've provided copies of a proposal for the inspector committee as well as legal staff that I would like to have reviewed if we could. And to this issue that we've been discussing for quite some time now, we would like to propose a potential solution. And so I've got a cover letter involved and then a sample language on the 3rd page. Regarding previous discussions so far, just today, right now on this matter, The party that has not been discussed in this entire matter is the insurance companies, and that hasn't been brought up. Now, I would like to point out that the insurance providers, by and large, require home inspectors to utilize a home inspection agreement in the process of conducting business in order to have proper coverage with an insurance company, okay? So when we talk about limitation of liability in a contractual agreement with a client, that has nothing to do with consumer notices, or that has nothing to do with preambles, okay? What that has to do with is the contract that we are submitting with our client as a business owner. Now, the issue has been stated, and I believe correctly, is that there is a disconnect between what the law says regarding subchapter G versus common language that's seen in inspection agreements throughout the state of Texas, okay? So our argument as business owners in the inspection community, and this has been brought up again and again, so we had a overflow capacity at the TREC full commission meeting where it got bounced back to the IAC, and then we had the heated conversations at the Inspector Advisory Committee that followed that one. What we would like to propose as a trade association, and I do have authorization from our board of directors of that trade association to speak on their behalf, is we would like to propose some language that actually specifies both. Because when you talk to the insurance providers, and this has been shown again and again, is that approximately 97+% of the claims that go against home inspectors are considered frivolous in nature. So respectfully, that would be a concern for the insurance provider, that we need to have some type of protection in place against things that are outside of what we should in fact be held responsible for. Now, when we look at subchapter G, and it says specifically negligence or incompetence, well, the specifics of the home inspection, what's negligent or incompetent, the specifics of the home inspection are the standards of practice. That is our baseline, that's our minimum standards, however you want to phrase it, but that's what determines and defines what is a competent inspection in the state of Texas. So what we would like to propose is some language that actually identifies both sides. And if we take a look at page 3, and there's a sample statement involved, it says, and I'll just read this statement if I may, so that everybody in attendance can hear this. Says that, and this is the actual statement itself. It says, this statement serves as notice to the client that your company name meets the Texas Real Estate Commission TREC professional insurance requirements as mandated by Texas Administrative Code number, professional liability insurance, and any other insurance that provides coverage for violations of subchapter G of Chapter 1102. As specifically stated in the TREC inspection report preamble, the home inspection standards are defined by the TREC standards of practice, section numbers, to which this insurance requirement specifies and is held accountable. However, this insurance requirement does not apply to inspection services, procedures, client expectations, or that are outside the standards of practice. Some inspection services or procedures performed may exceed the standards of practice or be of a value-add variety and are not recognized by the TREC standards of practice or this insurance requirement. Next paragraph, by signing this agreement, client acknowledges that the inspection fee paid to the inspector is nominal given the risk of liability associated with performing home inspections if liability could not be limited. Client acknowledges that without the ability to limit liability outside of the TREC standards of practice, the inspector would be forced to charge client much more than the inspection fee for the inspector's services. Client acknowledges being given the opportunity to have this agreement reviewed by counsel of his or her own choosing, and further acknowledges the opportunity of hiring a different inspector to perform the inspection. By signing this agreement, client agrees to limit any liability outside of the TREC standards of practice being limited to the amount of the inspection fee being paid by the client. And we feel that this is a very reasonable approach in which both sides of this argument are being addressed. The subchapter G 1102 is being recognized. It clearly states in here that your business entity does meet insurance requirements per state requirements, and at the same time provides protection, which the insurance companies are looking for, because honestly that's why this is in here, that would cover things outside of the standards of practice. again, putting more on the burden of the Standards of Practice Committee, but it draws a definitive line in the sand, if you will, that says this is what we are held accountable for under subchapter G, and this is outside of that arena, and anything outside of that arena is something that we're going to have some layer of protection in place with our insurance providers. Does that make sense?
So I kind of see that as if you wanted to submit that to legal to see, to verify, get their opinion on is this in compliance? Great. I don't want to see us get involved in standardizing any type of agreement or verbiage that's there. I understand from your trade association's perspective, if you want to ask Trek legal staff if that would be acceptable and verify that that is not, in their opinion, a conflict of state statute, and then take it back to your association and disperse that amongst your members if they want to cut and paste that. I think that would be great. But I don't want Trek to get involved with standardizing any part of any inspection agreement between the inspector and the client.
And I agree wholeheartedly, and thank you for bringing that up, because in the cover letter on page 2 at the bottom, it says, in addition, our association would request from the Inspector Advisory Committee and also Trek legal staff the following as a result of this proposal. In this meeting today, we would like to get some type of verbal acknowledgement that this is some type of acceptable limitation of liability language. Are we on the right track? Is this something that we can utilize moving forward? Is this something that, I understand you would probably like to have a chance to sit down and review this and take a look at it. But at the same time, is this something that we can look at moving forward with as a potential solution to this ongoing issue? Secondly, in a reasonable amount of time, we'd like to have some type of written approval from the Inspector Advisory Committee that this language or some reasonable variation of this language is acceptable for use by inspectors in the state of Texas.
They're an advisory committee.
Right.
They don't do written approvals.
Yeah. This can't be addressed
And
here.
I don't think this committee needs to be involved in standardizing.
Well, it also says and legal staff.
I think if you want to ask legal staff, does
Yeah.
this current verbiage conflict with state statute? I think that's a question they could probably answer. But beyond whether they could approve that language, I think that's a whole different.
Yeah.
Well, if it does, it's an inferred approval, because if it doesn't violate state statute, then that by result would mean that it should be a workable document and workable language that is a responsible notice to the consumer.
Greg, here lies the
Not
problem.
if it violates other laws, or if it violates other insurance requirements that your company may have or may not have.
Here lies the problem. This is something that goes into your contract, which we don't do anything with at all.
Okay.
You could put in your contract that I limit my inspection to $1, and I can get away with it until I get sued. So I could turn off a lot of people because I'm violating Texas law. But this entity has nothing to do with this component of it.
Does this statement violate Texas law?
I'm going to need to spend a whole lot more time than the last 2.5 minutes to make
Yeah,
that
it's
determination.
complicated.
I mean, it's not mirroring what the law says. I mean, if it was mirroring exactly what the law says, I would be more comfortable with making some sort of opinion on the spot. But I'm not at all comfortable making an opinion on the spot. But let me give you my card. We can keep talking. I don't think that this language is something that needs to be addressed. I mean, it definitely overlaps what we're talking about today. But I think that it wouldn't be a universal fix in a way that the committee is trying to address today.
Okay. Well, our ongoing caution on this is that we're dealing with an insurance required document.
Sure, which puts you in a precarious position.
And including the insurance providers.
Sure.
Okay, because it's the 97+% of claims that are of the frivolous variety. And so we need to have something that recognizes that there's going to be a limitation of that, because subchapter G1102 and what is a negligent or incompetent inspection is defined by the standards of practice. So once we get outside of the standards of practice, which all of us do, there needs to be some layer of protection in there against that 97% frivolous claim that comes through. That has been the. I know you're just getting in on this. This has been a fun ride for the last couple of years. But that's, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the crux of the concern, especially from the insurance providers, because if we can't have a layer of protection against frivolous claims, then the underwriters pull out.
Sure.
this committee and Trek, I don't believe we have the same concerns. But we don't want to tell you can't. We're not telling any inspector that you can't limit the liability. All we're saying is you can't do it if it's in direct conflict with state statute. That's the only component of liability.
Even if it is in direct violation of the state statute, the insurance companies still want you to put it in there because they don't want to cover the claims. Does that make sense?
The insurance company is working on a national basis.
Yeah.
Much back to kind of our ICC
Exactly.
argument a minute ago.
Yeah.
So they have standardized comments that have been forwarded to me, but we're here in Texas, and while the state requirement for standards of practice and what is considered a negligent or incompetent inspection is a very well-defined, it's very well-defined. Okay? So in talking with my insurance provider, and other people have talked to their insurance providers, and loads of information, has been presented on this, not only from other trade associations, but it went to Trek Full Commission, it went to Sunset Committee, there's been a whole lot of stuff that's gone on about this. Ultimately, as I understand it, and from what I'm getting from the insurance side, which is the party that really hasn't been brought up yet, the state of Texas is requiring us to, the state of Texas, as we understand it, is notifying us that our insurance required document with our client is in violation of state law.
Maybe. It may be in violation of state law. That's the whole really topic of discussion, is to identify that we are bound by state law to have certain insurance requirements in place, and for us to identify to the consumer that exists.
Okay, and the document that I just read accomplishes that.
But we can't address the document.
We can't approve or standardize any of that to go out to every.
We don't have the authority over that.
You want to send it to her for an opinion.
I just did. I got it.
For
right,
for
thank
that.
you very much.
Yeah. All right. Scott. Mr. Randall Needham.
Randall Needham Property Inspections. My question is, I sat here and I've absorbed everything everybody has said, and I'm still confused as to my statement that says your inspection is limited to the amount. You're telling me it's against the law, but who's going to do that? Is Trek going to come back to me, or is it going to go through the courts?
The courts.
So basically, you're telling me that even though it may be breaking state law, I can still have it in there.
It's just not enforceable is a problem.
Well,
okay.
I'll clarify. The law requires you to have liability insurance up to $100,000. It is not clear, based on many contracts that we've seen, that, well, I should say, consumers are unaware of that provision in law that you are required to have, and instead, oftentimes, are only have information in their contract, which says they have a limitation of liability to the cost of the contract, right?
Okay.
And so what we're saying is that it needs to be clearer to the consumer that that's not the whole picture, that they may have additional protections that are not in the four corners of that contract. So what we're talking about here is how to inform the consumer of that right.
Okay. So Saturday, I'm at a car show trying to sell a car to get my daughter married.
Sounds like me.
Got my SOP down there. I'm take time to review it from time to time just to make sure I get things straight in my head and I don't confuse things as I go through training and stuff, through the classes and continuing education. And a gentleman walked by and he looked down, he's talking to me, he stopped and he goes, "You an inspector?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "I am too. What's this limit liability that's going on through Trek?" I said, "Well, yeah, they're looking at this." And he says, "Well, I will either quit, double my rates, or triple my rates."
Mm-hmm.
If what?
If this language comes out. If inspectors are told that they cannot limit their liability, that this is what he's going to do. And I've had the same opinion. And then secondly, the insurance companies, we do have to provide that pre-inspection agreement to them before they will issue us insurance. They're reviewing this, and they're seeing their liability. So they're going to go up on their rates, which is going to go up on our rates, which is going to be passed on to the consumer. So who's benefiting in this? And the majority of the people, in reality, when it comes down to it, you're going to have to hire a lawyer, and most people can't afford to hire a lawyer because most of them are stretching to get into their home. So they're not going to be able to afford to hire a lawyer to take this to court anyway. It's kind of a moot point in some realm. So
I kind of think the insurance company's probably doing a poor job if they base your cost of insurance on believing that they will not have to support the E&O insurance that they're giving you the policy for. That's kind of weird. If they truly believe that limit of liability means they may not have to actually support that 100,000 E&O, that might be an issue on their part.
I guarantee the insurance companies know
Yeah.
what the state statute is, what the minimum requirements of that state statute are, and what conditions in which that would have to be paid out. I mean, we've seen numbers from insurance companies based on actual payouts.
Yeah.
And the vast amount of those cases filed were chucked.
Yeah.
Because they didn't apply. And again, this is why I wanted to specifically bring this one back up to clear up a lot of that, because there is a lot of misconception about what all everybody's saying is Trek's trying to limit liability. It is not what's going on. The whole point of all this is to make sure the consumer knows what the state statute is and what their rights are as it pertains to that. That's it. We're not trying to get involved with the agreement between the inspector and their client. It's just to find a way to let the consumer know what their rights are. That's it.
I think that consumer protection notice is...
I think it's a great way to
It's already
put that
built in the system and out there.
Yeah, and every inspector has to have it by rule. So, Scott, did you have any? Were there any other
behind you?
comments? Nope.
Right here.
Yes, sir.
Shannon Gatewood. Just if nothing else were to happen on this, and I was to put a 3-word sentence in my contract that said other than, or I guess the one, other than subsection G in that limits of liability, does that meet? I mean, like exactly what you're saying.
Again, I don't want to get involved. We don't need to get involved with what
I'm not asking for
says.
that. I'm saying.
If you want to ask me after the meeting what my personal opinion on it, I have no problem with that. But I don't want this body to be on record saying, yes, that's acceptable, because that is us getting involved in your agreement. And that is not what we're here to do.
I was just trying to connect 2 dots.
But you're, I mean, I'm not
Because
saying
that's
I'm
the
not
issue,
gonna
right?
bless.
Is subsection G. So if my contract said, my limit of liability other than subsection G is X.
Go to Occupations Code 1102, 1141. That's the requirement. So if you're
Pull verbiage right from there.
use that. That's what I would do.
So legal's going to go back now and document some verbiage for us to consider for adoption in a place we can drive our consumers to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're going to bring the consumer protection notice back in October for you guys to look
For
at.
you to review and make a recommendation to the commission.
So who wants to do that?
They're doing it.
Yeah, we'll handle it.
Okay.
Staff.
So we don't have to vote on this. It's just
giving direction to
we'll
staff.
bring the language forward, and then you guys can decide whether it's good, bad, tweak it, whatever, before you move it forward. Very good. For adoption.
We're going to change Tony's name to staff.
We already know that.
We will work.
It's on the bathroom wall in there.
Let's my name was on the bathroom wall.
On the wall. I thought it was in the center. All right. Let's reel this back in. Let's not get crazy. That's all right.
One more question.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Greg House, House Inspection Services. I'm concerned about the mixed message that's being sent to the inspector community. Not so much about the nature of the limitation of liability language, but it seems confusing to have the Inspector Advisory Committee and the legal staff tell us that they don't want to be involved in our inspection agreements, but then at the same time are going to tell us that our inspection agreements are not in accordance with state law, and then not at least approve or define what would be in accordance with state law or some variation thereof, when in fact we didn't go searching for this issue.
This isn't an enforceable issue where Trek is enforcing improper wording of an inspection
Okay.
agreement.
Then we need to understand what would not be improper wording. We've made a proposal. I actually like your idea too, as far as some variation thereof. But we're getting mixed messages here of, we don't want to be involved with your contractual agreements, but we're telling you that we're going to be involved with your
No,
contractual
we're an
that's not what we're
advisory
saying at all.
committee. We're an advisory committee that advises the commission from our industry.
Okay.
That's it. So because there's a state law that says you can't do certain things, it's been
What
brought
happens
to our
if nobody
attention.
changes anything?
Then that's the risk that you take as an inspector.
We have an
can't sit- I
obligation
can't
to
sit-
change
We can't
something.
sit as an inspection committee and tell you that if your agreement currently states you're only limiting to the cost of that, we can't tell you to change it. That's not an enforceable action. Okay, that's not an enforceable item, if I'm not mistaken. All we're trying
It's
to
not the
do,
language I heard at the last meeting.
all we're trying to do, which is why we're clarifying it at this meeting, all we're trying to do is find a way to notify the consumer, to educate the consumer that this statute is in place.
Yep.
So if they read an inspector's agreement that says nothing about that and says we limit the entire scope of the inspection to $400 or $500, at least they have some way of knowing that's not right. That doesn't mesh.
Yeah, that's really it in a nutshell.
I think there should be some clarification from, at least an advisory statement, not just a change. And again, I could
But
get
again, you're
blown
asking
up
us
for
to
this.
approve certain verbiage of that, and that does put us involved in the agreement between the inspection and the client. I
No,
agree
but
with
some base instructions on.
Let me work on it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I mean, I think that could be handled through an article that goes on the website, or once we have come on the other side of this issue and have a consumer protection language change, then we can talk about how to let the world know how this is finished, I should say. Because I think you're right. This has been this has been an issue for a long time, and it's taken, there's been an evolution to it that may not be linear. And so we will try to tie up any loose end by kind of closing the door on the issue once we're there.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
We've
Yes,
taken a
ma'am.
complicated issue that was quite polluted initially, and it's now been cleaned up to its essential role. So anybody we talk to that's a colleague of ours, we need to really make it clear to them that everything we talked about before doesn't exist. Everything we're talking about now, which is a very simple redirection of the consumer to a notice, is really all we're doing at this point.
Certainly progress.
Yeah, which is not easy.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Being that these took a little bit, why don't we take a break for 10 minutes, and then we will come back and hit item 8 and move forward from there. I just want to make sure everybody has a quick opportunity to go to the restroom. If not, so I will put the meeting in recess at 12:07 to reconvene at 12:17. 12:19, reconvene the meeting back in session. Moving on to item number 8 on the agenda, discussion and possible action regarding proposed amendments to 22 TAC 535.208, applications for licensure.
Okay, this is Tony Slagle, Deputy Executive Director. So this past session, there was a bill that changed the requirements for military spouses. And I'll get to that in a minute, what the requirements were. But in doing so, and trying to figure out the best way to implement that by rule, we realized that we were kind of all over the place in what we had in terms of the requirements for military, or the allowances for military spouses, active military, and vets. So we're recommending pulling all of those out and created a separate rule specifically for those requirements for real estate license holders and brokers. But the problem with having those requirements mirrored in the inspector rules, because they'd be the same, is making sure that we followed up if there was a change going forward. So what our recommendation is to do it for the real estate rule and just refer back to those rules for the inspectors. It would be, I mean, they're the same requirements, so it would just allow us that when the statute changes, we can change it in one place and it's applicable to everybody. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about these and then answer any questions. So the very first strike through is because our sunset legislation that passed removed any residency requirements. So we're removing those from the rule here under little b 1 II and then little b2. And then in the new 2, we reference the 53558 and just say that if you're a military service member, vet, or military spouse, you have to apply, you have all of these, this portion of the rule, 208, applies to you in terms of applying for a license unless otherwise accepted under 53558, which is the military rules. And then striking all this language related to the military stuff since it's going to be referenced in the other rule. So that's what we're doing to 208. And then with regard to 53558, as I said, we've added definitions for what these terms mean for military service member, military spouse, and vet, so that there's some clarity there. And then we added this language about except otherwise provided by this section, that B2 is what applies to inspectors. A person applying for an inspector license under this chapter must comply with all requirements of section 535-208. So, we should, anyway, so we'll change that. It shouldn't say this subchapter. It should say 208 of subchapter and then name the subchapter. So I call it subchapter R. So we'll change that moving forward. And then all of the requirements are the same as have been previously in the rule, just moved around and reformatted, with the exception of, let's see, where is it? G, the new G, which is limited reciprocity for military spouses. So there was a statutory change that, with the understanding that oftentimes someone's licensed in another state and their spouse gets assigned to a military base in Texas, they move with them. What do? So previously there have been some exceptions to various fees and exam requirements. What this does is it says if you are married to someone who's in the active military and you move to Texas, that if the state you came from has essentially the same requirements as Texas, you can operate without getting licensed in the state of Texas.
And this is what the bill
right.
does. So it's what we are obligated to do by because of statute.
Right. So the bill also offers provides the agency the ability to, while not requiring a license, issue a license. And to be honest with you, for someone coming under this particular exception, it would probably be helpful. So, because let's say you're coming from Oklahoma and you're operating under this, and you're trying to help a consumer. The consumer is going to say, "Well, where's your license?" So if we're able to issue one based on certain requirements that the statute allows us to do, even though they're not technically getting a license through the original or the right channels. Or not the right channels, I apologize, the alternative, that they would have a license in which they could show that they have gone through some steps with the commission to get approval for that. So that is spelled out under G. The license would only be good for the same time frame that the license in their state that they're currently licensed is for. So if it was a 1-year license and they have to renew it, they would have to come back to us and give us the requirements for it, or attest that they're current, and then we would issue another license for within that time frame. But essentially, that's what this rule does. It changes or adds those adds that language for military spouses to 535-58, and then 208 references back to that rule.
So the meat and potatoes is a limited reciprocity for military spouses for license holders beyond just inspectors. So the reason for putting it in this 535.58 is because it is for multiple license types. And so then we're striking the areas in the inspector-related rule, 208, and moving the language, then adding the reciprocity.
And how do you determine what's substantially equivalent?
Very carefully.
Yeah, we have to look at the requirements for state or for licensure in the other states, and Denise can probably answer that a little better than I can.
Generally, most states have a website where they're listing what the requirements are, and we just compare. It comes up more frequently with the real estate licenses, and we just compare what the pre-licensure requirements are for that equivalent license in the other state.
I would think this would be fairly rare for it to come up. Has it come up yet?
It is very rare. I don't believe it's come up for an inspector who's licensed in another jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, that may change based on the, the recommended requirements moving forward. But there is an obligation in the statute for the agency to determine if the applicant meets those, and then if they do, then
it makes sense to preemptively cover it because it can come up.
Right.
Protected under the statute, the rule.
Right.
So is it very clear that they have to apply in some way to have this statute utilized?
So what the requirement is for the, and I'll use the term applicant, even though that's probably not the right term, for the person, the out-of-state person, is they have to submit. Oddly enough, the statute requires proof of Texas residency, even though our statute removes that. So they have to provide proof of that, and then a copy of the military ID card or other proof that their spouse is actively pursuing a career in the military. And then we are required to determine the state if they are actively licensed in good standing, and if those requirements of that state meet our requirements. And then at that point, we will provide, the statute requires us to provide confirmation, and we will do that in the form of giving them a license.
Okay. Will it look any different than ours?
No, it'll just expire on the same time period as their license in the other state. So let's say they're licensed for a 2-year period in New Jersey, and they come in, they have 6 months left on that license. The license here would only be good for that 6 months, and then they have to, at the end of that, submit information to us so that we can reaffirm that they're in good standing for another 2-year term. The statute also limits this to 3 years or the time frame in which their spouse is stationed in Texas, whichever is
Would you give them a number?
Yeah, I
Then
believe
get
so.
a number that be searchable in our
Yeah.
database.
And after that time expires, what then, as far as their
The 3
renewal?
years?
Yeah.
Then they'd have to go under the statute is silent, but we assume they'd have to go under the normal, if they're still here, normal licensing requirements.
Would their previous experience as a Texas home inspector qualify them for
I would think it would.
fast track?
I don't know about that, but I mean, I would think that would be taken into consideration if they were here for 3 years acting as a Texas inspector under the statute.
Yeah,
I would
have to
think
go back and start
I think we'd have to come up with some guidelines as far as what they would have to do once that 3 years expires, what their steps are going to be in order to become fully actively licensed.
They could sit on that temporary license for 3 years and do not one inspection.
Yep.
And then fast track it to an actual.
Well, they have to. I think the way the experience works is you have to prove your experience, right?
Yeah.
Coming in, but not maintaining, right?
Well,
no,
that's,
but-
I think that's what he said, that when that 3-year period expires, then they'd have to come and apply under the
current
standard
standard.
licensing requirements.
So if they didn't do anything for 3 years, that would be taken into account that they don't have the experience as a Texas inspector. But if they had been actively working, I would assume we would take that into account.
Like a log of inspection?
Yeah, I don't know how
200
we'll prove
inspections
it
for the
out.
license.
I think we have a little bit of time on that one.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, this is a good, test case is the wrong word, but it's a good start on examining more general reciprocity. And so I think we will begin examining that for certain license types in the coming months. And if we can get to a solid place on more general reciprocity, that might be our back end fix, really, on what to do with these licenses.
And we've already looked at that towards, and I apologize again, but we already looked at that towards with the new requirements that the committee's recommending, is that if you come into Texas and you've already passed the national exam, all of the education, if these were to go forward, all the education that you took to get to that point, based on what these proposed rules would state, you would just go in and take the Texas stuff. So we're already looking at, for inspectors, taking into account that particular aspect of reciprocity.
Okay.
Okay, you got a comment?
Shannon Gatewood, does this apply to professional and real estate?
It's any license.
Okay, just
any
making
license
sure,
holder.
because like they don't meet the requirements for a professional, but they did for the real estate, so now they're
It's,
issued a
it's
real estate.
by you'd have to look at it by license
Yeah,
type,
okay,
yes.
just making sure.
Okay.
So, yeah, we just need some
Approval.
sort of a recommendation, motion from the committee to move forward with this rules proposal.
So entertain a motion to approve the rules as proposed.
Motion.
Second.
Motion made by Sean Emmerich, second by Bill Williamson. Any other discussion on this item? Yes, sir.
Are they gonna be subject to the same continuing education requirements? Did I miss anything about that?
So there is a stipulation in the statute, and I believe we've specified it in the rule, but I want to make sure that a person authorized to practice in the state under the subsection must comply with all other laws and regulations applicable to a license, including any sponsorship requirements. So that sponsorship requirement is in there because a broker, you can't come in as a sales agent if you're not sponsored by a broker. So yes, I would believe they would be required to meet all requirements to be licensed.
I mean, I think they'd have to be, but not until that 3 years is up, or if their expiration is shorter, because technically they wouldn't need the renewal hours until they had to actually renew the license.
Well, here's the
if they had
here's
3 years, you'd have to do it
actually
every 2 years.
Thank you for saying this. There's a bit of a I don't know what you want to say, fuzziness here, because the license is not renewed. You apply for it by statute. It says you cannot renew this. If you issue a license, it cannot be renewed. So it's a new license each time. So by that aspect, I don't know if
there would be any continuing
education would be required.
Unless the state where you were licensed requires.
They would have to take that CE, correct?
Yeah.
So it'd be doubling down if you required them to do it here. Outside, I mean, Texas SOP or something, that would be
What about
different.
insurance?
That's
Insurance.
just
I think insurance would be
All the laws
absolutely
That's
required.
all right, blanket.
This won't be perfectly clean,
And,
but
It's better than.
but the thought
It's not
from
either.
the legislature is how do we reduce barriers for people who are moving here because of military service, their spouses, and they want to be able to pursue a career, and the legislature believes that lowering these barriers is actually good. So, that's what the statute does.
I'm all for military support, but for the spouse coming in, they're supporting the military as well, so that's great, but I don't want that bar lowered too much. I think they should still meet the same minimum requirements that we would as individuals trying to become licensed.
Well, they've got to. It says, the statute says you have to have the same requirements, substantially same requirements to move from the state you're coming from, this state, in order to meet these requirements for.
Yeah, if they're in another state and it only requires 16 hours to get a full inspector
would
license, they're going to
qualify.
take that into consideration.
Sure.
Well, I think it might be helpful too to think of it, because I know the term reciprocity also had me kind of worried about what kind of different requirements we're reviewing this type of application against, but I think it's helpful to think of it in terms of the appraiser temporary practice permit, the person who's coming in from another state who holds the equivalent credential in the other state, and we issue it for as long as that other state credential is valid for. And that's essentially what this is. It's a limited reciprocity. It's only going to be valid for up to, max a 3-year period, and then if they want to continue, now we're looking at them as an initial applicant.
Okay.
So the term reciprocity, I know, kind of gives the impression that it's just a blanket, okay, you're
in.
authorized to practice here. It might be helpful to think of it in those terms, that it's really an extension of the approval you have in this other jurisdiction.
All right, so is there any other discussion on this item? Hearing none. All in favor of motion to approve, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no.
Hi.
Hi.
Be on the phone.
Got it. Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 9, discussion of possible action regarding proposed amendments to 22 TAC 535-206, the Texas Real Estate Inspector Committee.
So this is a rule that was proposed or was recommended by this body to the commission at their May meeting. It will go before the commission at its August meeting for adoption. There have been no comments on this, so feel free to discuss it, but there's nothing new to consider.
Right. Yeah, this is just changing the date of the terms to expire at the end of December on calendar year instead of February 1st, so on and so forth.
It's term limits.
Yeah, we talked about this last one. It's just we had to open it up for public comment, so that's where that was at. All right, entertain a motion to approve 535-206 minutes.
Make the motion.
Motion's made, second's over here.
Actually, no, because there's no change. This is just brought up in case you guys wanted to consider a change based on any comments. And since you've already recommended it be proposed for adoption, it's already been done. You don't have to.
So you're, I'm sorry, I should probably say.
Perfect. Item number 10, discussion of possible action regarding inspector pre-licensing education requirements to ensure the content aligns with the inspector licensing exam subject matter in accordance with the Sunset Commission's Management Directive 2.6, including the items that are listed there.
You want me to start?
Go for it.
So there have been some changes to these rules since they were proposed, and primarily the changes are to address some issues where the National Inspector Examination changed some of the terminology, and we believed it was actually better terminology for some of the names of the courses. But in essence, what we're trying to do with these new rules is to institute a transitional period by rule to allow people who are taking their education under the current standards to be able to continue to do that up to a certain point and provide that information to TREC for processing up to a certain point before, so that they're not doing it and then it's right. So there, I don't know if you want me to go through every one of these transition issues here. I'm happy to do so.
We were just talking about May 1st? I think was the break point.
That's still what the recommendations from staff are. In essence, anyone who is currently or who would be taking education under the current standards would have until July 31st to provide that information of 2020 to TREC for processing. But after May 1st, if you're just coming in, the current standards would apply at that point. And any education.
So what it means is that people who are enrolled in the current program prior to May 1st but haven't yet finished their courses will have 90 days from the effective date of the new education, which is May 1st, to complete the old coursework and move out of that program. And we'll continue to accept that pre-licensing education until July 31st. So then any person enrolling in a program beginning May 1st and going forward would need to be enrolled in the new program. Does that help clarify?
So
it gives the student the opportunity to finish.
Yeah, it's kind of like what we were trying to do with the last report form thing. So if someone approaches a school in April and we want to start school, at that point they would have to sign up and be done by July 31st. There's no opportunity to sign up under the new program because the overlap is not the same time frame that typically someone would go through school.
Well, I would suggest that if the education provider gets the new coursework approved prior to May 1st and wants to begin offering it, they could do that. We couldn't accept the new education until May 1st. So I don't imagine.
But they could start.
But they could start.
So it's
yeah, you can finish the old program or enroll in the new program.
So when a student enrolls, let's say a school, is there any notice given to TREC that the student has enrolled?
No.
No.
Okay, so they could, in February, sign up with the school, as long as the student knows that even if you finish everything, you can't do anything with TREC until May 1st. But come May 1st,
right,
you could present all the materials and ready to go into testing at that point.
So what'll happen is if this, if this committee is good with this language, then what staff will do is prepare notices to be sent to our education providers and make sure that students who are enrolling know what their options are, so that they know ahead of time.
And you could start approving the classes, so by some point in the spring or here in the late fall, they would know their stuff is already approved, and if there are people that work school at the same time, take 6 months, they know that here's an approved course. They could sign up with the school, say in February, start working on it, with a plan of sometime in May finishing up. And
Mhm.
at that point, they could actually put in their applications and test by then.
That's right.
They just wouldn't count until May, and they'd submit them in.
Well, May 1st before you could actually implement. But the
Right.
school could offer and start teaching before then and have the courses approved well
Right.
before then.
Right.
Okay.
On page 19, section 4, if the applicant fails the application exam, or fails the examination 3 consecutive times, and they go subsection A and B. For an applicant who failed the national part of the examination, building science module 1 or building science module 2, and then B, for an applicant who failed the state, Texas law module, Texas standards, or Texas standards practice. Is it, they have those choice of any of those?
Yeah, the
Or
way
is
this-
it supposed to be and?
Because currently there's certain hours required, but there's no subject matter really attached to those. It's
No.
just you have to take this certain number of hours. When coming up with the module idea, that there'll be a set kind of, this module does this module does that, and determining which one would be applicable to which portion of the exam you fail, we thought, well, A, it's up to the student to determine where they need the help. So is it 1 or 2? And they're how long are they? 30-hour modules or
40-hour.
40-hour modules? And the same thing with the Texas portion. Which portion do you need to focus on before you have to take the exam again? So it's up to the student to determine of those. So it's not an and, it isn't more.
Should we put in here an expiration of the 535-212? And that goes away.
We could.
Or do we
think I
just
would
readdress that next year?
Yeah,
and
I
then
think
remove it?
we will then remove it. Once we get over this hurdle of the
Period and all that.
transition, then we will review those rules again and pull out the sections that are no longer relevant.
Okay.
And along those lines, in terms of process, I did want to mention that 535.209 and then 212 and 213 will need to be readopted.
Reproposed.
I'm sorry, yes, thank you. Reproposed. 218 and also 214, I'm sorry. But it's a new rule. 218 can be recommended for adoption in August because there's no additional.
Huh? We did need clarification on one thing. If you're ready to go to that point, but I don't want to.
I just, another little quick thing on page 25, it says April 31st, we can change that to April 30th.
Oh.
Thank you.
It's a leap year.
Yeah, exactly. On page 32, deliver notes regarding the ride-along session on a form approved by the commission. We have that form already, correct?
Yes.
Make sure we have that. All right. Stan Harbuck, I believe, wanted to speak on this agenda item. Mr. Harbuck.
Yes. Just a few quick things. I know I've already sent in some detailed comments, so I'll be very, very brief about this. But I had a question. Actually, it wasn't in my comments about the transition rule. And it sounds like we're trumping the transition rules that usually allow for a 12 to 15 month period of transition for, depending upon format of the course, for when we change the rules on requirements. The other questions or other notes that I had, which do relate to the comments that I've made earlier, are that we're still increasing the hours for the Texas Law and Ethics course from 8 to 20 hours, which is an increase rather than a decrease as per the Sunset Commission recommendations. The Texas SOP from 4 hours to 24 hours increase. And then also there's some redundancy in the SOP coverage for courses. In 2 of the courses, Texas law requires coverage of all the rules relating to home inspectors, including the standards of practice, and also the SOP course covers those as well already. And then just a recommendation, if the Texas SOP course covers all the SOPs, but there are only the 3 categories of 5 that are actually in the standard that are being used here: electrical, structural, and mechanical. Using the documents, some books that are published by NHIE, if you sort of portion out how much time they spend in their books on some of these topics, you find that analysis and finding would probably only amount to about 4 hours proportionately for that coverage for the NHIE curriculum that's being proposed. The business and professional responsibilities portion would only represent 2 hours proportionately. And so those hours are much greater in the proposal here than they are, relatively speaking, proportionately for how much is covered or how much of the topic is covered in pages wise, whatever, with the NHIE book. Also, I don't see any grandfathering in here for current students, which once again I'm very concerned about. And also, of course, as mentioned in my comments, I would suggest that recorded video should be allowed to be used for both the practicum as well as the ride-along. Thank you.
Okay. Tony, did you want to answer that?
Well, Stan, this is Tony. I'm curious when you say what you mean by grandfathered.
Well, when the home inspectors were first licensed, the law stated that, and the rules allowed for as well, obviously, that the home inspectors that had done a certain number of inspections and so forth, or had been experienced for a certain number of years and so forth, they would not have to satisfy any of the education requirements that were newly proposed under the law and so forth. So basically they got experience grandfathering in there, and they didn't have to prove anything about the courses that they took when they first prepared themselves to become a home inspector, and whether those are close to or similar to the courses that were then required under the new law. What I'm suggesting here is that both the 130-hour sequence as well as the 200-hour sequence of courses whose course listing doesn't mirror each other exactly, but they're very close, that those courses within each of those 2 sets of sequences are so close to the NHIE curriculum that any students that have taken the 130-hour series of courses or the 200-hour series of courses at some point before these deadlines and so forth should be grandfathered in as well. They're doing far more than the original home inspectors did when the license law was first enacted by showing at least a similarity to the courses that are now going to be required under this proposed rule, under the NHIE portion of the proposed rule. So my suggestion would be that these students are taking these courses in good faith, that they're going to be given some credit for it. And it would be a shame if, with a reduction in hours like this, that they weren't given credit for an appropriate number of hours for the number of hours they've taken, especially when the courses they've taken very, very closely mirror the NHIE portion of the new regulations.
I don't know. To me, it seems like we're giving an awful lot of time for this to happen, for this transition to happen, and it's up to the education providers to educate their students when they're providing these courses of whether they're going to expire or be eligible for the new track or just for the old track and those dates that are there. I think if we start putting in gray areas and grandfathering stuff in, I think that creates kind of a logistical nightmare for staff to try and keep up with all that.
It's over a year from now.
Yeah.
Right, it is over a year from now, and what we just discussed was the inclusion of that transitional period, which allows any students enrolled in the current path to licensure through education have until July 31st to complete their coursework.
And the way the rule is currently proposed, if they chose to do so, they have up until April 30th to enroll in those courses too. Mm-hmm. So a provider could offer them up until that point if they needed to.
Actually, what you're saying essentially then is we should expect that these people will finish up with close to 400 hours of courses when at the time it would probably be easier for them to back out of all of the courses they've already taken, at least if you don't grandfather them in, and start over to match the lower hours numbers under the new courses. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they have a year to complete those hours. I think that's more than ample time to complete that line of coursework if that's the coursework that they've started at this point.
So I don't think you're understanding that you're still requiring them to finish out a large number of hours instead of allowing these courses that are very similar to the NHIE portion of the new regulations. They're very close. So anyway, I won't belabor the point. I've made my point, but it's just a caution here. We make rules that are very detailed, and I think it's very important that we try to make sure that we reduce the harm that we cause whenever we make the rules. I think what we're doing here is we're harming someone who, in good faith, is on a path to complete almost 400 hours, and they maybe have already taken the 130-hour course series of courses or the 200-hour series of courses, and then these new regulations pop up. I think it's more appropriate and fair to them if we say, look, by the way, yes, that 130-hour series of courses or that 200-hour series of courses closely mirror the NHIE portion of the new regulation. We'll waive that portion. You still have to do the rest. You still have to do the practicum. Still have to do the other things that are part of, that are not covered by that. But we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt on courses that are very, very similar to what you've already taken. We don't want to harm you. We don't want to treat you unfairly. We're not trying to push you out of the market by making you start all over with a course, even though you may have already learned all of those things already through your 130-hour series of courses or your 200-hour series of courses. I think it's a matter of fairness to them and allowing them entry into the profession and avoiding the risk that it's restraining entry into the profession.
Okay. Any other comments on these on agenda item 10?
Can you clarify that?
Yeah.
One clarification.
Okay.
The way that agenda item is written is broad. It's to address the pre-licensing education requirements. So we're covered, but I did want to make sure that everyone was aware that there is a new rule, 535.214, included in your materials, and that we would like a recommendation on. And that's simply, it's language that you've seen before, but it's a reworking of the structure of the rules so that it will be easier to simply repeal to 12 when those rules are no longer applicable and the new 214 is applicable in its stead. So there's dates associated with when it will apply.
So if you recall last time, the proposal was to repeal the current 212 and propose a new 212. This essentially does that, but instead of repealing 212 and proposing a new 212, it would allow 212 to be
the two can exist at the same time for the
with
transition.
dates on when they're.
Do we have a copy of 214?
You do.
It's in the
It
materials.
is on page 23.
And I do have a question about that. I do need clarification about one thing in 214. It would have been needed to be clarified in 212. It's the same thing that the committee proposed. It's the same rule the committee proposed last time that the commission proposed, with a couple of exceptions to the names of the courses, a reference to the 214. But I do have a question about F, which is stricken in this version, to get some clarification on essentially what that language says. Courses completed for a real estate inspector license shall count towards the identical qualifying inspection courses for a license as a professional inspector if the course was completed within 5 years of filing an application for a professional inspector license. And staff couldn't remember why that language was put in there, because currently education, if I'm wrong, there's no expiration on education. Once you've taken it, it counts when you apply if you took it, you know. So we were a little, I guess, confused as to where that language came and what the impetus was to include that happens strictly. And if the committee would be okay with proposing it without it.
Yeah, it would be our recommendation to remove it.
I don't see why. I mean, I mean, you can look up everybody's education from. I can look it up from 10 years ago.
Right.
It's there.
Mm-hmm.
I completed it.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other discussion on this particular agenda item? And then we'll have to break them apart for certain approvals. All right. So it's
so we're not breaking them apart. We're doing all of 10 at once.
No, I just said we're breaking at least one of them apart, and then we'll be making the motion or proposing a motion for the remainder.
Okay. Is this the place where I would make a quick note on 10C and 10D then, or not?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. On 10C, the difference is with it and 10B is that there's only one, and that's the same concerns apply, by the way, for 10C as for 10B that I mentioned earlier. And I should say at this point that virtually every one of the points that I've made, I believe, directly relate to not creating unnecessary restraint to entry into the profession, amongst some other concerns. But on 10C specifically, the subtopic hours for instance, building module 1 and 2, amongst the others as well, where you have subtopic. So it requires the creation of courses with those hours specific to those categories, say for instance, mechanical or electrical and so forth. I would just encourage you to drop those, because if you look at, once again, a comparison I've shown in the notes, the comments that I've submitted, shows that if you use, once again, these books that the NHIE has developed over time and see how many pages they devote to each of these categories that follow their NHIE outline, you find that in a number of cases, their proportion of those topics as covered by the number of pages in their books is very disproportionate compared with what's being proposed for these subtopics. And so I'd encourage you throughout these proposed rules to take out those subtopic hour requirements and allow the trainers to decide how much in each category they should train. The trainers have a very strong incentive in being able to help their students learn the NHIE curriculum and also the Texas curriculum as well. They're judged on that by the pass rate. And so all of us want to try to do our best. And instead of having it, in a very rigid number of hours, which keeps us from maybe spending a little more time on another topic. I mean, if I wanted to teach the NHIE curriculum using the NHIE books, I would have to trim back some of the information that they provide in some, and I'd have to add some in others because of the discrepancy between the proportions that are in the new regulations versus the proportions that are in their books. So that's a concern. I would encourage you to drop those subtopic numbers. On 10D, and you may want to take a look at 10D because I think, and I don't know whether it's been put this way in the past, but on 10D, shouldn't it say in there that the course listing there, can you pull that up? Get there. Okay, so where are the changes for, is that 10D there?
No,
31.
31, thanks.
Oh, okay. Maybe if you could go to that, and it'll be easier for everyone to see if that's okay. There we go. So it says 24 hours in the following. I mean, maybe I'm a stickler for grammar here, but it seems like, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, Chelsea, but it seems to me it might be better to say something like 24 hours in any of the following subjects. Otherwise, it looks like that course has to be covering all of those topics. It could be interpreted to mean that. I'm concerned about it anyway, and I realize it wasn't written up with that in the past. It looked to me like clearly further down you already limit any of those topics to 16. And you may feel like it already kind of says that, or how could it be interpreted any other way? I just thought it might be a little clearer to everyone concerned if we said 24 hours in any of the following subjects. But that's all I had to say. But I would like to hear what Chelsea recommends on that last note that I made.
Well, what we're intending to say is that the following subjects, that you should spend 24 hours addressing all of the following subjects, right? Rather than any. No.
It's any. It's just 24 hours in the following subjects. It's not 24 hours or 24 or this 3 courses in these subjects that make it sound like it's inclusive. It's just 24 hours in the following subjects.
So what Stan's saying is, could you spend 24 hours in foundations?
No, because it's limited further down to 16 and 81.
Well, what we didn't want is, we had a problem where we got 32 hours. We know 8 of it's dedicated. Yep. But we wanted some diversity in the training, and there was a potential that an inspector could take all 24 hours of the elective training in one subject and not be diversified. So we said, okay, it's got to come from this group, but it's got to be split up between at least 2 subjects.
Okay, that makes sense. Well then, Stan, I think your suggestion of adding any is perfectly acceptable.
It's certainly not going to hurt. Certainly not going to hurt. It just actually clarifies it a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree.
Mr. Carter.
Also on that list, I know that
Can you stand up and say again, please?
Sorry. Roy Carter, Director of Inspector Education with Champion School of Real Estate. I know in our subcommittee meeting we had on June the 28th, we talked about adding the electrical and appliances, which I see is there. But when you drop down and you have the other approved courses, it still speaks as though these are the only 3 other approved topics that we could use for continuing education.
That's current rule language in
yeah, I understand.
In 213. I don't know how else to, I mean, we're trying to make sure that this doesn't change what's currently required, and that's the language that's currently in 213.
Well, this is CEs, right?
Yeah, but the way CE works is it says 24 hours in, and it says it's described in 535 213 E1, 8, 11, and 12. And so that's what that is. That's a listing of those things. And I don't, again, without changing the context of the rule, we're just simply restating what it's saying.
Can we change shall to may?
Well, then you're opening it up to anything that might not come under the general topics. And that's
well, this was all pulled out of the QE courses to create this. So I don't understand if we're doing this change, why we can't open it up.
What would you like to introduce? That's
well, because you don't have any of the optional system items included in this list. These are all based off the items that are within the 200-hour coursework as we currently have it. So my point being is if this is a CE requirement, you got a QE requirement courses that are listed in here, but you don't have the other courses that could be.
So Roy, what I hear you say, this is Jennifer, is that this is now more limiting in the CE topics.
I don't know about that. I mean, I'm looking at 213 right now, and there's not under E there. I don't see other listed anywhere currently.
What's other?
Other optional systems. I don't see them listed in there. So this is what's listed currently under 213. Because I'm looking at the wrong rule. It's foundation, framing, building
optional
enclosure,
systems is SOP.
roof systems,
So
plumbing systems.
basically what you're trying to say is if somebody wants to do septics, water wells, something like that, it's not included as part of
Sprinkler system.
But then it says shall
I see
include
that. I
one
can see
or
that.
more.
Then
It says or more.
but it defines the 3.
It defines 3.
Right. Yeah,
It limits
All
the
of those systems should be that.
So what he's saying is in
it's
the
different.
optional parts of the SOP is septics,
the
water
SOP.
wells.
Yeah.
What's in the
Yes,
SOPs,
swimming
which
pools.
includes optional systems, which should be acceptable for
Yeah.
CE credit.
Okay.
So where are we at?
That's a good point.
So what do you think, just change that to May?
Well, how about to that initial list? Go back to the list of 5.
Oh, 31. It was because
31.
I had it listed.
Where?
You said we should.
31.
31.
So.
No.
So if there was, I mean, we've basically got the report form sections kind
You
of
don't
in
have-
there, but if there was between appliances and report form, you put optional
Optional
items.
systems.
Optional systems from the.
Optional SOP items?
That works.
I mean, that way you could give a class on the irrigation.
I mean, if
Yeah, if we could include, I think he's right. If we could include that in some way, it's just a matter of how we word that.
Because I can see Roy is talking, if you were to give a CE class on irrigation, it wouldn't fall in
Wouldn't
there.
fall under that.
And we currently, and then you got septic systems, you got all of those things out that are currently being offered. Because we always spoke about the CE courses in relationship to us getting more into the advanced areas too, and not just staying just
Yeah.
specific to the QE side of everything.
Well, the intent of the CE is to reinforce the mandatory training that you're required to do.
Right, I understand that. But we also advance too.
Nothing says they can't do more than 24 hours. If they're gonna do something advanced, we're gonna make sure they do the basic stuff first, or know it. Then we could open it up to somebody who does 24 hours in advanced stuff and does no continuing ed on basic.
Oh, no, I'm not saying the list, I'm
So
just saying
this,
making
I
the list
think-
more inclusive of other
I
things
think we
that
can
could be in
fix
fact.
this by
Yeah.
All right,
changing
so
shall to
I think we're in.
The optional system.
I think we're in agreement on that. It's just a matter of how do we word it, how do we put it in this 535-218 under the section A that we can include those optional items as prescribed in the
So
SOP.
Jen has a suggestion of the under 10, little x,
Right.
changing which may include one of the following. So
Okay.
other approved courses as they relate to real estate inspector, and then which may include one of the following, and then that allows.
Although you could just end it at other approved
Inspections?
courses as they relate to real estate
I'm
inspections.
fine with that.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, just a blanket,
I think that's more inclusive.
easy.
Yep.
And you're saying delete all?
They have to
Delete
be-
everything from the comma forward.
It's less prohibitive.
And they have to be approved,
Yeah.
so you, at that point, you determine are they inspection related.
Yeah.
Yeah.
According to the SOP.
Yeah.
Is there any reason not?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's cheap.
No, all the way
All
down.
of it.
I
All
go all the way
Going
down.
down all the way.
All the way to 3.
Right.
Yep.
We can ask them about it.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
We'll ask.
There you go.
Very sensitive. Oh.
Just go
That's
after
okay.
the-
Anyway, I can't edit it anyway. I was just
We've
trying
got
to.
the, we've got the note on here.
It'll go from, so we'll say other approved courses as they relate to real estate inspections, semicolon, and then you'll skip down to, and then you'll say and.
And then
you'll
8
skip
hours
down
are
to 8
non-elective,
hours.
yes.
Yeah.
all
And you
those.
might actually want to change other acceptable courses as they relate to real estate inspections. Does that make more sense?
Well, what? Instead of approved.
No, I would say approve. You want them approved.
Yeah.
You're
Like,
gonna look
The
at
one
them,
for
you're
truck
determining whether they're acceptable when you approve them.
yeah.
Needs to be approved.
Right, but I'm talking about the subjectivity of it. What is the first top of the language again?
Foundations.
24. Oh yeah. Okay. Never mind. Thinking from a reviewer standpoint, not it.
I just got a question I should probably know the answer to. Is there anything that limits an inspector from taking every 2 years electrical and or plumbing, where it keeps them from diversifying? I mean, if they take the same subject.
You can't
The
take the same
16-hour max.
course in 2 consecutive renewal periods.
You can take the same subject.
But you can take the same
but not the
subject.
same course.
Right.
We do make
Actually, you
them,
can't exceed 16 hours in the same subject matter.
Well, I'm
Within the
talking,
same
Within the
renewal.
same
I'm talking
renewal
the
period.
next
I'm
renewal.
talking about on the
period.
next renewal.
Oh, I see.
Because if there's somebody who used to be an electrician, he likes that kind of stuff.
Takes
he
electrical
just keeps
101
taking-
every 2 years
Right.
to do that. Yeah, it's prevented. You can't take the same course
Okay.
in subsequent renewal periods.
Right. So,
What section is that?
we,
yeah.
It should be. That's I know we had that conversation. in the
My
past.
laptop died.
The same is true, I mean, with lawyers, you can, you know, you can take, there's very little regulation on what you can take for your CE.
I mean, people find a way around it. They just call it electrical A instead of electrical 101. It's the same class, but
So there is a question, 535.218, where we've just been, could be recommended for adoption with these changes at the August meeting. All of, this body has reviewed all of the other rules with, the exceptions of what we pointed out, what changes we've made since then. Previously, but we're asking that they be reproposed in the August meeting. 218 could be up for adoption at the August meeting, which would allow the provision on the back side of the page, section G, to move forward more quickly, allowing inspectors to get CE for attending a meeting.
Any meeting, rather than just the February one.
Right.
So in essence, you could wait and just propose all of these in one, and then they're adopted all in one swoop, or you can pull 218 out since it's already been proposed and the changes are non-substantive enough to where they could go forward and adopt it. That way the CE, and I don't mean to step on your feet.
No,
That way the CE goes into effect soon.
I would recommend we have entertain a motion to pull 218 out and approve that one with modification.
And just for clarification, the way this is worded, see where it says C through F, no change?
Right.
So D, which is right in the middle of that, D2 says the commission may not grant continuing education credit twice for a course with the same course content taken by a license within a 2-year period. So that's where that is. We're not changing.
But that's within a 2-year period.
Yes.
Right? But that's any 2 period. It's not just on the renewal cycle. It's any
Okay.
2-year period. So it can overlap over renewal cycles.
And there's nothing horrible with taking the electrician's course again in 2 years.
No,
Even though
but
you're real familiar with it.
you do want people
You
to
do.
diversify and do appliances and plumbing, electrical,
But they may be
foundations.
experts in all areas except electrical.
And they can do it, they just may not get credit for it.
Well,
Yeah,
in 2 years.
Yeah, it doesn't limit,
I
doesn't limit
encourage
how
them
much
to do
what
it
it can
every
take.
year.
Yeah.
They just might not get credit if it's within a 24 calendar month.
Essentially, we should be well exceeding our minimum requirements anyway.
Okay, so where we're at right now, I would entertain a motion to accept 535-218 as currently amended.
Or as discussed.
As discussed.
I so
Modified.
move.
Motion is made. Is there a second?
Second.
Second down there. Any other discussion on this particular item, the 218, 535-218? Hearing none, all in favor of approval 531-218, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, signify by saying no. Motion carries. Move back to the rest of 10, which is entertaining a motion to forward the proposed amendments to 535-209, 212, and 213, right? And the new 214.
When you say forward.
Forward to the commission for
proposal.
approval.
Okay.
For proposal.
Proposal, sorry.
You're recommending proposal of those.
To the commission.
Yeah.
This is Stan again. I'm sorry I kind of jumped ahead when I was speaking earlier, and I didn't give Chelsea a chance to answer a question I had about the standard transition rules that normally allow that 12 or 15 month period of extension to take courses and finish courses. And I'm assuming that because we do get specific here in these rules about how long you can go and how long you go beyond when the new rules have been adopted and so forth, that this rule will supersede that transition rule that gives these transition students, let's call them, a 12 or 15 month extension to finish the courses that they're currently taking. Is that right?
I'm not sure I could follow your question, but is your question, are we within the kind of typical standards of a transition period?
So,
No, there.
Stan, this is-
Hang on just a second, Stan. Hang on.
Stan, this is Jennifer. I think what you're talking about is what we did with the real estate pre-licensing courses when we revised the content of each of the course, and then also raised the standards for the course design and delivery. And we built into the rules the opportunity for education providers to have 12 months to revise classroom delivery courses and 15 months to revise distance education courses. But I would suggest to you that this is actually something different. That was revising the courses that already existed. This is creating a new education program, so there's a distinction there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought there were some standing rules, let's call them, because I think you're saying that the 12 and 15 rule you're talking about was tied to a particular rule change, but it was my impression that there were, and I apologize if I'm wrong, I thought there were some generic sort of standard, rule. There was a standard standing rule, if you want to call it that, that applied to any rule changes on courses that gave that 12 to 15. I'll look through the standards. I don't want to belabor that.
Yeah, you can
with this meeting.
Take a look through it and let me know if you have questions. But it's specific to something that is not applicable in this scenario. What we're doing here.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer, for the clarification.
No problem.
I think this is mainly an issue of notice, to give providers and students proper notice of what's coming so that they can plan for it. And then we're also, we are under a directive by the Sunset Commission to review and streamline by January of 2020.
Mr. Carter.
Roy Carter, Director of Inspector Education with Champion School of Real Estate. I just got a question. In relationship to anybody that was on the old program, based on the fact that the education doesn't really expire, so if in fact somebody did finish their 90-hour topics, because there's 11 topics in there, and they wanted to apply, and they submitted their application along with those certificates of what they already completed, wouldn't staff take a look at that to see what part of that education would cross over, or would everything that they essentially did go away?
You need to come in under one program or the other, is the way that this is written.
Okay. So
not an.
And you have until July 31st.
Oh, I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to.
So if you wait too long, yeah. That's a problem.
I'm with you.
Okay.
Get her done.
Yeah. Okay, so back to entertaining a motion to recommend to the commission proposed amendments to 535, 209, 212, 213, and 214.
I recommend to forward to the commission the proposed amendments for 535, 209, 212, and 213.
And 14.
And 14.
Motion's made. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second made. Any other discussion on this proposal? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed say no. And that passes. Item number 11, discussion and possible action regarding proposed amendments to 22 TAC 535-220, professional conduct and ethics.
So this rule was recommended to the commission in May for a proposal, and they did propose it. And there have been no comments to this. So this is on the agenda simply for you to discuss any comments that were to come in, none did.
Any comments on this particular item? If not, we'd entertain a motion to.
We already.
That's already there because
Yeah.
there's no changes, right?
You're in a good rhythm now.
I am. I'm all
Just
on.
ready to vote.
I'll tell you the same is true for agenda item 12.
That's good, yeah. All right, any other discussion on agenda item 11? Hearing none. Moving on to agenda item number 12, discussion and possible action regarding proposed amendments to 535.222, inspection reports.
This is the rule, if y'all will remember, that reduces the number of days that a client has to pay for an inspection from 3 down to 2.
No.
No?
Reduces the amount of days the inspector has to deliver the report.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
After
I was
payment.
thinking-
Close though.
Well, not really.
Yeah, I wish we could
Delivery to
Ties
reduce the number of days
So
they
it
have
helps
to
on both
pay.
ends.
Yes.
And the only discussion that I've had people bring up, I have people pay weeks before, and it says that I have to deliver it within 2 days of when I got payment.
Well, how are you
getting
getting paid?
inspection yet?
You getting a credit card in advance?
Yeah.
Some do.
Well, that's an authorization, that's not a payment.
Well, some charge you.
It's
Well,
in
I
my
think
bank account.
I think you can
Well,
clear that
you work
up
on
by
that.
the last part of that sentence, unless
Otherwise
otherwise
agreed.
agreed. Just
I
have
won't
it
give
in
you the
writing.
report until I do the inspection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then if they agree with it, then you're good.
But then, once I do the inspection,
2 days.
2 days is already gone by.
No, it
No,
starts
2
the-
days from the completion of the inspection.
2 days from the inspection?
The completion.
Or the receipt of payment?
The completion of the inspection.
Does it say that?
Well, it says for each inspection. If you haven't done the inspection, that rule doesn't apply.
And if you haven't completed it, you have an incomplete report. So technically, it's a completed
So
inspection.
but the question is, so you see where I'm going there?
Yeah.
Is there?
There's
is
no
there a
question,
grammar-
come on, I'll keep it on.
Diana, mute.
I mean, I've had a couple of phone calls on this, like, okay, so I get paid a week before the inspection. Do I still have 2 days after the inspection?
Yes.
Even though it's been
It
paid
doesn't
for
say
7
that.
days?
I know, but you gotta look at it, you gotta look at the
Look at number
whole,
one.
you have to look at it in its entirety. Number
Unless
one
otherwise
says,
agreed.
prepare a written inspection report noting the deficiencies and other required to be reported and deliver the report with it. You can't
Yeah.
take two outside of one.
Well, so I've prepared the inspection report, which means I did the report,
Uh-huh.
and I deliver it within 2 days of payment, which was 7 days ago.
Observed deficiencies.
Yeah.
So if you haven't observed them yet, you
Yeah.
can't.
Doesn't apply.
Well, I know.
2 days.
So the question is, the question put to me was, I got paid a week ago, I did the inspection today,
You still have 2 days to deliver it.
I've got 2
Right.
more days.
After
I
completion.
mean, that's the intent.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
pretty clear.
Yeah.
Would it be receipt of payment or performance of the inspection?
Performance of the
Whichever-
inspection is one.
Whichever is later.
Preparation, prepare a written inspection
So the
report.
2 days goes to both of them,
Yes.
not just the second
Because
one
there's an
that says
and between
payment.
them.
It's in.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Because I thought it was kind of fuzzy to me, but I knew what it was, and then I started getting phone calls, and it's like, well, maybe it's not just me.
And on your credit card, you can have your credit cards authorized, but not captured.
Have a
You
public
set it to
comment.
do that.
Have a public comment from Mr. Roselle.
It can be problematic.
I would abstain.
I'll tell you
Okay.
later.
I've been doing it for 17 years.
Any other comments on agenda item number 12?
What's that?
Any other comments on agenda item number 12?
Nothing changed?
Okay, all right.
We need to go back to 10 because there's,
Can they close out 12?
yeah.
Yeah, we did.
They
There was
did.
no other comments.
There did, because we need to speak about bifurcating the exam. You were gonna,
Oh,
Yeah.
well, if anybody had any questions, I mean, we've talked about it at other meetings. Does anybody have any questions? We've talked about how the recommendation is going to be to separate the national and state exam, should the applicant choose to do so. What the rule says in agenda item 10 is that the applicant must take if the applicant wants to take the national exam first, they need to complete all of the national education, and then they'll receive authorization to take the national exam. And they have the opportunity to then take the Texas component and then register and take the Texas exam. The exception is that if a student chooses to take all of the education first, they have that option. And then take both exams at the same time. And the mindset behind this recommendation is that the level of detail and the intricacy of all of the information that an inspector applicant needs to know is difficult, and especially in the sense that the national education, a lot of what you learn in the Texas component are the exceptions to the national standard. And so going into a test where you've got to keep both of those, equally
separate.
Yeah, right. How to keep those separate when you're taking, both exams at the same time. And so our hope is that this will, better qualify the students because they get to focus on the national before focusing on the Texas component, make them better prepared and better equipped to take and pass the licensing exams. So
I think it's exactly what we were looking for, is to
Absolutely.
give them the flexibility.
The opportunity to separate them out.
Doing national test, basically flush what you don't need to know, and then do the Texas module and Texas test, but still give the ability, if they're superhuman, they want to do it all
Right.
at once. I mean, we've kind of seen with a 47% pass rate that taking them both at once can be problematic, and most of the feedback I've gotten from testees is they would probably benefited if they didn't have to learn everything at once.
We're allowing them to the opportunity, if they learn in a different manner, to.
But they have the option of taking them both at once, or they can do them one at a time.
We're good.
Did anyone have any questions about that?
That was our intent. That's what you.
Just wanted to make sure that we didn't skip over that.
No,
in
no,
case anyone has some
perfectly fine.
issues.
All right, so we'll move on to agenda item number 13, discussion of possible action regarding the 4-hour inspector legal update continuing education course and the 4-hour SOP review continuing education course.
Do you want me to start, or you want to weigh in? Or? Okay. So the the legal update course is done. It's formatted. Are both manuals formatted, the student and so both manuals for what we need is the exam to be completed. So what we need from the committee is some volunteers to help with that process, and we have a kind of a short turnaround because we want to make sure that we get this to the providers so they can use it. We have a base exam already that we give, so it's not reinventing the wheel, but we do need to make sure the questions conform with the new update.
Right.
And that if there's any questions that need to be tweaked, they're done. So what Jen and I thought is if we could get 4 or 5 of the inspectors on the committee to volunteer with when do we need the questions by?
Well, we need to have them available as soon as possible for our education providers, especially those who use a distance learning platform because they need to program in the exam. So if we have the materials to them and ready to go now, I think we would need to have this shored up no later than 2 weeks from now.
What if you were to submit the content of the course, send it to the inspection committee members, all 9, including the public, and then let them send you back questions. Now we do still want to include what we were talking about earlier about
right, you want to do that add-in.
Yeah, the add-in to the legal update.
I mean, that could be one of the discussion, what do you call it, scenarios in that chapter that would be
about the
easy.
liability issue and making sure the state statute, that your limits of liability or your contract doesn't conflict with state
So
statute.
you want us to propose questions back to you?
Yeah, well, I think what we thought was rather than reinventing the wheel, we could, in order to make this be efficient, I don't think we can send, I don't know, how would we do this?
Well, first of all, the exam that exists is proprietary, and so it could only go to committee members, not the public. We could, what I could do is look at that content and compare it against the current course materials, the new revised course materials, and see where we have any holes with new topic that's not covered on the exam. I could coordinate with the committee members getting this information out. Sure. What we may need to do is just look at the questions that are still relevant. Maybe we want to ask the committee to
tweak the wording,
tweak them a little bit. Maybe make the answer the question and add new distractors or something like that. And then again, if there are areas where we have gaps, then ask the committee members to provide some questions and answers to those
If you want to
topics.
send it out and put a deadline on it,
Yeah.
and just, here we go, here's the date, have this back to me, have your changes or suggested questions back by this date, and be done with it.
Does that work?
That works for me if it works for the committee.
Yeah.
So we run the risk of having a bunch of, I guess, competing questions rather than assigning different
Never having a
categories to
problem with
different
too many
members.
questions.
Okay.
Well, that's true. And honestly, we need a bank of
Because the provider will
50
pick
questions.
a certain number of questions.
Well,
as
we have 3 exams, and each
And
one
they
has
pull from that
16
bank.
questions.
Yeah, so we need about 50 questions, even more. The more questions, the better.
Yeah,
The bigger the
bigger the
bank,
bank,
the
I have
better.
to have it.
So even if we have competing questions, we can determine, we can.
As long as everything's covered.
Yeah.
Right.
Mr. Carter.
Will we have this in time enough to do our approval forms to get it submitted so that we can start offering this by September the 1st?
Yeah. That's why we're talking about doing this within the next 2 weeks.
If we do it,
Well, and to Roy's point, 2
y'all
weeks is
pushing us
tough.
You're pushing us up against the window when we got a September 1st deadline when the current course expires.
Can you get the course and
Can we have it done within a week?
Without the,
Sure.
I mean,
No,
can the
I-
exam follow separately?
Yeah, can the exam follow separate?
Because you're not
That's up to
modifying
y'all,
the
because
exam.
we gotta submit it to track in order for approval. So
Yeah,
when
but I
they
know what you're
approve it,
talking
then
about, the
exam.
process for that, which is signing the exam confidentiality agreement and then getting it back
But
and
if
password
they,
to unlock
if we
it.
get the exam done by the end of July, but we send them today, or send the providers, let the providers know that I'm just asking, I don't know.
Right, no, I
That the
understand.
coursework's available for them to start developing the course towards it, but the exam will follow in 2 weeks. Does a month give you enough time for the exam portion to get all the stuff you need to do for that?
Well, y'all giving us the question, so I'll be fine with the exam.
So,
As long as
is
we
your
get the
concern
course
getting the
in.
content right
Getting
now?
the content, getting everything we need, so we submit our course approval, we don't get a roll-off.
Yeah, the content's done.
Well, no,
Yeah,
but it
we just have
hasn't
a
been,
little
it's
add-in.
He
just,
doesn't have it.
yeah.
No, no, I know that. I know you don't have it, but I'm just saying that shouldn't be an issue, because it's been formatted and it's done.
Right, well, we now, after this committee meeting, there's something
Y'all
that
adding some stuff.
needs to be added.
One thing, and
Just the one little blurb about the limits of liability.
I'm good. I'm good. I'm just saying, we got a September 1st deadline, and we gotta see stuff.
you are good.
So,
Content too.
unless we're gonna be
Oh,
fast
yeah,
tracked
sections
to the top of the course approval piles.
Even if it's just a note.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, Roy. We'll get this out as soon as possible. We'll get the content out, and then I'll see if we can get this committee to get the answers to the exam questions within a week and send those out. But you should, you can go ahead, once you have the materials, you want to send the course application in and the exam confidentiality agreement, send it all in, and then as soon as we have the exam, we'll send it out to you. I don't think it should hold up our approval of the course, you waiting on us to give you an exam.
Works for you?
And I'm good, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
It would keep you from creating a course around the test questions, because you don't know what they are yet.
True that.
Well,
So,
we'll get you the manuals.
I think
I didn't want to move on to the
Well, we're
SOP
ready.
unless we're ready to do that.
I think we're good.
So this committee has committed to developing content for an SOP review continuing education course. The reason this is on the agenda now is so that we can get started on that process now, rather than waiting and then kind of
Throwing it together.
So it's going to be the purview of the education subcommittee.
which probably will follow his modifications, although we have a general idea, but as he tweaks the SOP, that would be the perfect update material for the
I don't,
next year.
but I don't know if we're gonna be done with that review.
It won't be by September.
I was gonna say, there's no way we've
We've
got
got
at
at least
least
another
another
year.
Not by
Well, this is
September.
next-
This gives us
next
2
year.
years.
Yeah, we
2
need-
years.
we need at least
But
another year to do this
We can
process.
start working on the content, the outline, what it's
Yeah.
going to look, and then where we need to change it based on that
Absolutely.
adoption, we
Yes.
can do that. But I just wanted to get the ball rolling on this, so we're not a year and a half down the road and go, oh, and then having to approve the
Yeah, no,
content
that's what we
outline
talked about
again,
before.
because the committee has agreed to do this. So I just want to make sure.
We're kind of assuming the SOP will be in place before the next 2-year approval, 24 months from now, and the perfect information in that SOP update are going to be things that are changed.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know that word.
All right, anything else on agenda item 13?
No, sir.
Agenda item number 14, a request for future meeting agenda items. Anybody have anything that they would like to have on future meeting agendas?
I have one. Any proposed meetings that are over 3 hours that Trek provides lunch?
We can't by law. I'm so sorry.
Cafeterias.
But you could buy lunch.
There we go.
I can buy- I can provide lunch
expense for
to
you,
Trek.
right? Perfect.
I'll get a sponsor on that.
It wouldn't
I
have
have brought in the past. I've brought like Danishes and stuff and donuts, and they just no one eats them. They
Because
just
you don't
sit
tell
here.
us they're in
No,
there.
they're on the table.
been the check stuff maker.
I eat as much as I can.
But no, I understand. We can make if we know, and this was a pretty hefty agenda. We'll make allowances and talk to the chair about what we can do in terms of maybe breaking for lunch or something like
Yeah.
that.
If we could do it just a break for lunch,
Yeah.
20 minutes, because I'm usually cramming coins in the machine out. while
I
we're
got
waiting.
you. So.
Well, and we can order in Jimmy John's, and
There we go.
everybody has to pay for
Yeah.
it themselves.
Yeah,
Pay
but
for
we can
itself
do
with
that.
cash.
We can-
I'd be fine with
yeah,
that.
we can do that working on
Yeah.
so,
I
okay.
didn't mean to jump so
Yeah.
No, I get it.
So any other item for future agenda items?
So staff, whoever that is, will bring language to you guys about the the consumer protection notice regarding the.
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah. I think that's the only item that's been carried forward from this meeting. Correct.
Anything for education to work on at this point?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we'll have to have another meeting after the new rules are proposed, just to make sure if there's any comments that we are able to address that before we bring it to the committee at the next meeting.
So this goes to the full commission, which is what day?
For proposal.
For proposal.
And then it comes back after, we have a public comment phase, and it comes back to us, and then we propose, recommend for approval at that point.
So August 12th is when that will be brought forward.
I want to specifically say thank you for the education committee, because that was a huge endeavor to really go after the pre-licensure stuff, and you guys did a fantastic job. That's a lot of work.
Sharpen up the machete.
I think it's great. It's a huge change. It's a huge shift in what we're talking about, and that's not and it may not be perfect, but I think it's a move in the right direction, and we're going to try it and see if it works. And if it works, great. But I'm sure we're going to have some modifications to it. But that was a huge endeavor to do. So you guys did great.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Discussion future meeting dates.
The next meeting is scheduled, remember there's actual set meetings, is October 21st, Monday, October 21st.
We talked about how we could modify that.
You can.
Thank you.
Is there any way to, we talked about it, but setting a certain day?
That's what this is.
That's what this is.
So it's the 21st would be, it's the third Monday of the month, in the middle of the month. So the date that's supposed to be the meeting date is October 21st.
I cannot do the 21st.
That's an established date, correct? Because I've got
Yeah, but we can't modify it.
Yeah, it's moving forward. The middle month of the quarter, the third Monday of that month is what is proposed to be the set date for the inspector committee to give some consistency.
Is it better to stick with Mondays, or would you like to adjust it by a day or two?
Mondays or Fridays are usually good with me. I like Mondays. I can do the 7th. I can't do the 21st, the 14th or the 21st.
Mondays are all.
The 7th is already.
Fridays.
ESAC.
Are you sure that's not the 14th?
The Monday.
What is it?
14th is Easter.
Oh. Because I think they're supposed to be
I can do the 7th or the 28th, but I can't do the 14th or 21st.
Iceland? Iceland? Japan. Are we good?
What are we looking at?
Either the 7th or the 28th of October.
Earlier is better.
Earlier is better, so 7th?
Yeah, so the 7th.
October 7th?
10 o'clock?
Yeah, works for us.
I think this agenda will be lighter, and if it
Yeah.
goes any different way, we'll suggest changes.
So Monday,
Hey,
October
Lee?
7th.
Yes.
Hey, I just wanted to apologize to everybody. That outburst of mine had nothing to do with the meeting. I was doing something at the same time as I was listening to you guys and the insurance stuff, and I'm really sorry. I apologize to everyone.
It's okay, it's in the minutes, it's fine.
I'm so sorry.
All right. All right, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Yes.
Was that the 7th? Did you say October 7th?
Yes, sir.
October 7th, 10 a.m.
at 10 a.m.
10 a.m.
All right. Meeting is adjourned at 1:39 p.m.
Right.
Thank you, everybody. Mr.